Joffrey Baratheon's wedding to Margaery Tyrell was always meant to be a triumph of power and prestige, and for a moment, it seemed the day would fulfill those promises. The sun shone brightly upon the royal procession, bathing the streets of King's Landing in gold. The bells of the Great September of Baelor tolled with deep resonance, a clarion call that summoned nobles and small folk alike to bear witness. All eyes followed the young king and his bride as they approached the sept. Joffrey cloaked in shimmering crimson and gold, Margaery resplendent in pale green and silver. Rose petals drifted through the air, and the memory of war seemed temporarily banished, replaced by a spectacle of wealth, beauty, and possibility. For Margaery, it was a performance as much as it was a ceremony. She walked with regal grace, her arm resting lightly on Joffrey's. She could feel the tension in the young king's body. He did not share her flair for spectacle. All his life, Joffrey had been told he must rule by fear, by absolute authority, that mercy was weakness and generosity was a trap. Yet today he was called upon to charm the crowds. Margaery had coaxed him into wearing a gentle smile, and though he looked strained beneath the polished facade, he managed to maintain it. Somewhere behind them, she could almost sense Cersei Lannister's gaze, watchful, taut with suspicion. The Queen Regent, recently overshadowed in title by Margaery, did not easily relinquish her protective hold on her firstborn son. But for this wedding, at least, a show of unity was required for the sake of the realm. The vows were spoken, the sealing kiss exchanged. The cheering was uproarious once they were pronounced man and wife, and Joffrey turned to face the crowd, wearing a near smirk of victory. He had won. He had proven his power by marrying the most desired young woman in the Seven Kingdoms, had paraded his dominance with every flourish of gold thread. Confetti of flower petals and scraps of colored parchment drifted around him as he lifted a hand to command silence. His voice carried across the courtyard when he addressed the onlookers, offering words of thanks and promise, though they were stiff and obviously rehearsed. Yet even so, the wedding was a spectacle of success, a testament to the might of House Lannister and the cunning alliances of House Tyrell. Soon after, the feast commenced, unfolding in the Red Keep's courtyard and the opulent halls beyond. The sun had climbed high, yet it had not lost its brightness. There was a scorching brilliance to the day that seemed to imbue the festivities with relentless energy. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, suckling pigs, fresh fish from Blackwater Bay, and every exotic fruit and delicacy the crown could afford, and some it likely could not. Musicians filled the air with lively tunes, interspersed with the occasional bawdy song. Wine and ale flowed freely, 1,000 cups raised in toast to the king and his new queen. Laughter, chatter, and the metallic scrape of knives on plates wove a tapestry of cheerful chaos. From the dais at the head of the feast, Joffrey reveled in the attention. He beckoned for more food, demanded more shows of entertainment. Dwarfs in mock battles, jugglers with flaming torches, musicians forced to improvise under his cutting commentary. He called for fools to cavort and mimic great lords, and he laughed with sinister glee whenever they took particular aim at his Uncle Tyrion or other guests he held in secret or overt contempt. In the swirl of noise and spectacle, many could only look on with forced smiles. Those in attendance remembered Joffrey's cruelty, or had heard rumors enough to fear it. Yet the king was in a generous mood, at least outwardly. He tossed coins to the entertainers as if wealth were boundless in the city, and he offered sweet compliments to Margaery, taking visible pleasure in her every appreciative nod. She played her part admirably, coaxing the crowd, calling for applause when he demanded it, and praising him, albeit in carefully measured words, for his kingly munificence. Cersei, seated near her father Tywin, observed everything with a hawkish focus. She wore a rigid mask of satisfaction, but her eyes seldom left Joffrey's form. Beneath her calm exterior, she was anxious. Her father had insisted that stability in the realm hinged upon this wedding. The Lannisters owed enormous sums to the Iron Bank. They required the Tyrell alliance for coin, food, and influence. The war might have quieted with the death of Robb Stark, but new threats always loomed. Balon Greyjoy still styled himself King of the Isles, Stannis Baratheon plotted at Dragonstone, and in the far corners of the eastern seas, whispers of dragons were circulating. Stability, in short, was precarious, and Joffrey, volatile, vicious Joffrey, was the king who must hold it all together. Today's wedding was to be a sign of a bright future, of unity. Cersei prayed that the day would conclude without incident or scandal. Nearby, Tyrion Lannister sipped his wine with reluctance. He was there, performing his own role as Master of Coin and as Joffrey's uncle. Shay's watchful eyes flickered now and again from the table where the ladies sat. Sansa Stark was beside her, seemingly adrift. The tall, slender girl had perfected the art of concealing her misery. She wore a mask of courtly courtesy, offering a small smile when spoken to, staring at the rich tablecloth when not. Tyrion pitied her yet felt powerless to truly help. He took a measured drink and forced himself to appear calm as Joffrey demanded something new of the performers, likely at the expense of someone else's dignity. At the far end of the feast, a hush began to spread. The servers were bringing forth the massive wedding pie, a monstrous confection of crust and sugar, filled with live doves that would burst forth upon slicing. At least, that was the plan. Gold cloaks parted the way for the bakers to roll the behemoth forward, accompanied by a small retinue of musicians who heralded the arrival of dessert with triumphant notes. Excitement rippled through the crowd. Even Joffrey rose with a smirk, stepping forward with his bride to do the honors of slicing open the great pastry. Marjorie, smiling, placed a steadying hand on his forearm. He raised a long knife, etched with lion and rose motifs, and plunged it through the crust. Amid squeals from the crowd, half a dozen doves fluttered out in a mad flurry of feathers. One soared overhead. Another landed in front of Lady Olenna Tyrell, cooing indignantly. The Queen of Thorns sniffed, lifting a brow at the poor creature. It was a moment of hilarity and delight that momentarily overshadowed the usual tension. Even Tyrion allowed a grin to quirk across his lips. Then Joffrey demanded Tyrion bring him wine to wash down the sweet taste of the pie. In the real course of events, would-be watchers from another world might recall, this was the moment everything turned sour. But in this turning of the wheel of fate, something stayed the invisible hand that sought to poison the king. A young cupbearer stumbled on the steps to the dais, nearly sloshing the contents. Joffrey let out a growl of anger, flicking a withering glare at the servant. Tyrion, quick to avert disaster, intercepted the flagon before it spilled entirely, managing to fill Joffrey's cup only halfway. The confusion lasted mere heartbeats, but it was enough time for Marjorie to step in with a sweetly chiming laugh. The king's cup should not be half empty on this splendid day, she teased. She reached for another carafe herself, one that had been sitting further from the dais, away from prying eyes. Unbeknownst to those who had plotted treachery, the poison-laced wine was the one originally meant for Joffrey's final toast. But Marjorie's quick thinking, and her desire to spare Tyrion from Joffrey's wrath, unintentionally thwarted the designs of those who wished the king dead. She filled Joffrey's cup from a safer vintage, and the tension dissipated in a wave of relieved laughter as the king took a hearty gulp. If anyone suspected a plot had been foiled, it did not show. Most eyes were on Joffrey, many expecting him to choke. But instead, he wiped his mouth on a napkin and slammed the now empty cup back down, demanding a fresh slice of pie. Unpleasant as he was, the king remained alive, the day continued, and the wedding feast roared on. Only a few sharp minds might have noticed confusion in the lines of Lady Olenna's face, or the flicker of anxious calculation in Peter Baelish's eyes. Though he was not physically present, the seeds of his cunning had long been planted. The orchestrators of the murder had just witnessed a critical misstep. The great game, however, seldom allowed for immediate clarity. Events would unravel over time. As the evening deepened and torches were lit, Joffrey's mood took a predictable dark turn. A hush had fallen over the higher tables, as the king entertained himself by ridiculing those around him. He mocked his uncle Tyrion's stature, commanded Sansa to stand so he could tease her once more about her traitorous lineage, and tossed coins at the feet of the dwarfs he had hired for his grotesque pantomime of the War of the Five Kings. Lady Olenna departed early, citing a headache. Mace Tyrell laughed too heartily at Joffrey's jokes, attempting to bury his embarrassment. Even Marjorie, who had maintained a serene poise throughout the feast, began to tense beside her new husband. She strove to distract him, urging him to dance or mingle with their guests. But Joffrey seemed determined to press his audience's patience to the limit. Yet the hour grew late, and one by one, guests began to bow or curtsy, retiring for the night. The king was left with fewer victims to toy with. Tyrion lingered only as long as courtesy demanded, ushering Sansa away. The last notes of a half-hearted harpist echoed in the courtyard as servants hurried to clear the tables and gather leftover food. Joffrey swayed on his feet, a bit drunk, still complaining about the dwarfs who had not performed authentically enough. Marjorie placed a hand on his shoulder and murmured an insistence that they retire. He finally acquiesced with a scowl. Together, they left the remnants of the feast behind, climbing the steps into the Red Keep. In his private chambers, Joffrey peeled off his wedding finery, flinging the heavy cloak onto a chair. Torches flickered against the stone walls, the light casting a restless glow across the king's features. Marjorie watched him carefully, unfastening the delicate pins that held her embroidered gown together. He ranted about the incompetent servants, the ungrateful lords, and the mocking dwarfs. Eventually, he ran out of steam. When he looked at her, he felt some measure of triumph. She was his wife now. He had taken her from Renly's memory, from any designs the Tyrells had, and made her his. The flickers of cruelty in his eyes mingled with a heated curiosity about this beautiful creature he had claimed. His mind drifted to less chaste designs. But when Marjorie smiled at him, softness tempered his anger. For all his cruelty, Joffrey was still a youth who craved praise and adoration. Marjorie had become adept at crafting illusions. She treated him with careful tenderness, praising his splendor, thanking him for the grandness of the day. She guided him gently toward calm conversation, coaxing him to talk about the events that pleased him. Joffrey responded, boastful and immature in equal parts, but sufficiently mollified. The bloodlust in him was banked, at least for this evening. Their wedding night proceeded with clumsy tension, a collision of Marjorie's practiced grace and Joffrey's domineering inexperience. By the time the final candle burned low, he had fallen asleep, satiated by wine and a sense of power. Marjorie lay awake longer, staring at the ceiling, aware that the path ahead was precarious indeed. Morning in the Red Keep brought a tangible shift. Whispers spread about an apparent mishap with the king's cup the night before. Some claimed it was a near poisoning. Others scoffed at such rumors. Regardless, Joffrey appeared at the breakfast table alive and well. Cersei embraced him, somewhat unusual for her, pressing a hand against his cheek as if to confirm he was warm and breathing. Tywin, wordless, merely observed the young king, searching for any sign of frailty or change in temperament. What he saw was the same petulant youth, full of scorn, now married and thus bound in a new alliance. He wondered whether that alliance would be the saving grace or a harbinger of something worse. Sometime that day, the news that the poison had failed, if poison indeed it was, began to leak to those in the shadows. Olenna Tyrell, in her apartments, pressed her lips together in consternation. She was not one to be easily thwarted, and the ramifications of Joffrey's survival might be grave for her granddaughter. Elsewhere, in the darkest corners of the city, through the channel of secrets that ran from Flea Bottom to the high walls of the keep, fingers pointed. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some suspected Tyrion Lannister had orchestrated a failed attempt. Others thought the Tyrells were behind it. A few even whispered that Varys the Spider was testing the waters, or that Peter Baelish's cunning hand had reached further than expected. Joffrey, oblivious, barked orders at his Kingsguard, strolled with Marjorie through the gardens, and reveled in his moment of triumph. He had no idea how close he had come to greeting the stranger on his wedding day. Under the watchful eyes of the court, King Joffrey's new routine settled in. He adored flaunting Marjorie as his queen. She was charming, beloved by the small folk, and far more adept at playing the game of courtesy than Joffrey would ever be. Each morning, they would hold brief audiences. Joffrey would hand down judgments, often harsh, and Margaery would step in with a word of mercy. Sometimes he heeded her counsel, sometimes he sneered at it. When the two appeared side by side, lords and ladies studied the interplay, uncertain whether the Tyrell rose might tame the Lannister lion, or if the rose's thorns might cut too deeply. As the days wore on, Cersei found herself unexpectedly grateful for Margaery's influence. Though she would never openly admit it, she saw that Margaery's presence curbed some of Joffrey's worst instincts. The king would listen to his wife up to a point, when Margaery suggested hosting charitable events or inviting certain courtiers to dine. To Joffrey, it was an opportunity to show off, to bask in the adoring gaze of the people, which he craved whenever it did not annoy him. Margaery cleverly framed her suggestions as ways for him to garner greater love from the realm. The word love intoxicated Joffrey nearly as much as fear did. He had always believed fear was the surest means of control, but now he could toy with the possibility that love might be another method of commanding loyalty. He vacillated unpredictably between these impulses, granting boons one day and punishing trifling offenses the next. In truth, many in the court were stunned that the new queen had lasted even a fortnight without suffering the king's rage. Margaery handled him deftly. She would flatter him with affectionate gestures in public, resting a hand on his arm, whispering in his ear, while in private, she was unwavering, sweetly insisting on her positions without challenging his authority outright. She spun illusions of suggestion that made Joffrey think her ideas were his. Cersei smoldered with jealousy to see how Margaery could accomplish what even she could not. Tywin noted it as well, silently acknowledging that Margaery Tyrell was a formidable ally. Jaime, still coming to terms with the loss of his sword hand, watched from the sidelines, torn between relief that his son, though he could never name Joffrey as such, was finding some measure of stability, and disgust at the boy's cruelty. He seldom offered Joffrey counsel, aware that his niece-nephew's respect for him was fragile at best. Amidst the daily spectacle, no one forgot the precarious political situation beyond King's Landing. The War of the Five Kings had died down, but its embers still smoldered. Roose Bolton was installed as Warden of the North after betraying the young wolf. The Ironborn still clung to certain coastal strongholds, and Stannis Baratheon had retreated to Dragonstone, gathering strength for what he believed was his divine right to rule. King Joffrey showed little interest in strategy, preferring to leave such concerns to his grandfather and the small council. He relished parading around as a conqueror, yet seldom attended war councils for more than a few minutes at a time. Some whispered that if the realm faced a true crisis, Joffrey's lack of discipline might prove disastrous. Yet Tywin was still Hand of the King, and his iron will propelled the machinery of governance forward. The Lannisters and Tyrells worked in conjunction to restock the royal granaries, quell rebellious rumors, and bribe or intimidate those lords who wavered in loyalty. The city itself saw incremental improvements: fewer starving orphans in the streets, a slight drop in the cost of bread, efforts Margaery took great care to showcase as the king's generosity. Joffrey accepted the praise with a sneer of pleasure, convinced of his own magnanimity. Tyrion's position remained fraught. He still served as master of coin, but the narrowing of Tywin's eyes whenever Tyrion spoke during council was a constant reminder that the imp's fortunes were tethered to Lannister grace. Joffrey, emboldened by his new status as husband, found fresh ways to torment his uncle, demanding impossibly extravagant expenditures and blaming Tyrion when the crown's debts loomed. On a personal front, Sansa Stark had grown more withdrawn, haunted by the memories of what had befallen her family. Tyrion tried to comfort her, but their relationship remained awkward. The court seemed to teeter on an unspoken question. How long would this uneasy peace hold? Late one afternoon, Tyrion found himself summoned to a private meeting with Tywin. The Lord of Casterly Rock stood at a tall window in the solar, hands clasped behind his back, gazing out over the Blackwater. He barely turned his head when Tyrion arrived. The tension in the room was palpable, and Tyrion braced himself. Finally, Tywin spoke, his voice low and commanding. "We have reached a fragile juncture in the realm's affairs," he said. Your nephew is king, and for now, the Tyrell alliance keeps the capital fed. But my patience is limited when it comes to Joffrey's excesses. I trust you understand that." Tyrion offered a measured nod. "I do, my lord." Tywin continued, unblinking. "You will keep a close eye on him. I care not if he believes you are at fault for every misery he endures, so long as your presence acts as a moderating force. Should he jeopardize this alliance or the stability of the realm, you will do what is necessary to protect our family. The Tyrells are powerful. I will not allow them to undermine us, but neither will I allow Joffrey to ruin what I have built." There was an unspoken threat in Tywin's words. Tyrion exhaled slowly. "You place great faith in my ability to influence his grace," he said, choosing his words carefully. "He rarely hears advice I offer, and if he does, he openly scorns it." Tywin turned, eyes hard. "Then you must learn to make him listen one way or another. He is a boy with a crown he did not earn, illusions of grandeur, and a dangerous temperament. If he can be guided, guide him. If he cannot—" The silence completed the sentence with chilling clarity. Tyrion realized, perhaps for the first time, that Tywin was prepared to act against Joffrey if the boy threatened Lannister power. The realization unsettled him, though he tried not to show it. Was Tywin suggesting regicide if Joffrey proved uncontrollable? It would not be the first time a king met an untimely end, but it would certainly tear the realm asunder. Tyrion left the Solar with a sense of dread. If his father was considering the unthinkable, how many others might be as well? The Tyrells, the Martells, the Baratheons on Dragonstone, the scattered Starks and Tullis. There were plenty of factions that would want to see Joffrey fall. The imp felt suddenly suffocated by the weight of a city's worth of secrets. As the weeks drifted into months, life in King's Landing returned to a routine of polite chaos. The new king and queen were seen at tourneys and feasts, bestowing compliments on the highest bidders for their favor. Marjorie's charities distributed bread and ale to the poorest districts in the king's name. Joffrey continued to stage elaborate hunts in the Kingswood, occasionally inviting favored lords or knights to join him, though he often grew bored quickly. His mood swung unpredictably, from bouts of violent rage at the slightest inconvenience to eerie moments of generosity that left courtiers guessing. Word of the king's unpredictability spread far and wide. One morning, the king declared he would hold a special court session to celebrate the glory of House Lannister and House Tyrell. He wished to reward loyal subjects, punish traitors, and demonstrate his absolute authority. The throne room was packed. Lords from every corner of the realm stood in attendance, along with knights, ladies, and curious onlookers. Some had legitimate petitions. Others simply wanted to see the king in action or watch the new queen's famed poise. Torches burned bright along the walls, but even in the flickering light, the Iron Throne commanded the greatest attention. The twisted swords seemed to reach skyward, an emblem of conquest and intimidation. King Joffrey strode into the hall, resplendent in a gold-trimmed doublet bearing the crowned stag-lion sigil. His Kingsguard flanked him, Jaime among them, face unreadable. Marjorie appeared at Joffrey's left side, dressed in a flowing gown of pale green, roses woven into her hair. She glided gracefully, offering small smiles to those gathered. Cersei came next, followed by Tywin, who walked with measured authority, head held high. The hush that fell was profound. Joffrey settled onto the Iron Throne, a theatrical gesture that sent the slightest shiver of iron scraping on stone. The herald announced the commencement, and a line of petitioners began. One by one, they stepped forward, lords seeking taxes remitted, knights requesting lands, merchants complaining of bandits. Joffrey spoke with pomp, mocking some, granting swift, harsh judgments to others. Now and again, Marjorie would lean in, and after her soft words, Joffrey's approach would soften, if only for a moment, awarding a boon here, a leniency there. It was a display of raw, unrefined power and the subtle manipulations of a queen. The court watched in fascination, uncertain which side of Joffrey they might provoke if they pressed too hard. Tyrion, standing among the spectators, felt a pang of worry each time Joffrey's eyes sparked with malice. The realm was balanced on a knife's edge, and a single moment of madness could tip them all into the abyss. Then came a surprise. A messenger from the Eyrie arrived, wearing the sigil of House Arryn. He knelt at the foot of the throne, voice trembling slightly. "Your Grace, I bring tidings from Lady Lysa Arryn. She wishes to reaffirm her loyalty to the Iron Throne and House Lannister, provided certain concessions are granted to her son, Lord Robert. The Vale stands ready to render aid." He glanced at Tywin. "If called upon, in exchange for certain agreements." Joffrey sneered. "What sort of agreements?" He eyed the messenger as though he were a roach scuttling across the floor. The messenger swallowed, adjusting his footing. "Lady Lysa requests that the boy Robert remain secure in his rulership of the Vale, free from foreign intervention, and that the Crown recognizes the Vale's neutrality in any conflicts that might arise, unless the Vale is directly threatened." Tywin's features remained unreadable, though he inclined his head slightly, indicating he wished to speak. Joffrey gestured for him to proceed. Tywin stood, his voice echoing in the throne room. "Lady Lysa's terms sound much like an attempt to isolate the Vale. Yet we would be remiss to ignore the strategic importance of those mountains. The Eyrie is a strong fortress. It may be in the Crown's interest to secure a friend there, rather than an enemy." Joffrey tapped his fingers on the throne's arm. "The Vale? A child rules in the Eyrie, and the mother stands behind him. They have hidden in their mountains for all these years, taking no part in the realm's battles. Now they show interest." His tone was disdainful. "Why should we grant them anything?" Margaery placed a hand gently on Joffrey's forearm, just enough for the gesture to be visible. She spoke quietly, her voice lilting through the hall. "Because, my king, a mother's desire to protect her child can be a strong motivator. If we show the Vale a kindness, we may win a lasting friendship. And with winter near, the roads treacherous, it is better to open the gates than leave them closed." Cersei watched Margaery's intervention with a tight expression, but she said nothing. Tyrion noted how deftly Margaery phrased her suggestion, appealing to Joffrey's sense of regal generosity, not to the realm's actual strategic needs. Joffrey, for his part, paused as if weighing how his vanity might benefit. "A lasting friendship," Joffrey repeated, rolling the words on his tongue. Finally, he seemed to conclude that the prestige of magnanimity outweighed the boredom of dealing with the Vale. "Very well. The Crown will agree to Lady Lysa's terms, on condition that she sends men or gold when requested. We are not granting them neutrality to cower in their mountains forever. The boy Robert must bend the knee." He glared at the messenger. "Bring those words to your lady. If she truly wants friendship, let her swear it under the Seven. Now go." The messenger bowed deeply, muttering thanks, and hurried away, relief evident on his face. The crowd exhaled softly. Tyrion exchanged a glance with his father, who nodded once, giving a faint impression of approval. Joffrey's approach had been high-handed, but it was a step toward forging an alliance that might further stabilize the Crown. Margaery's influence was clear in that moment. The rest of the court session proceeded with relative smoothness, but the undercurrents of tension remained. Some courtiers whispered that the king was too easily swayed by his new wife, while others whispered that Margaery was the best thing to happen to the Crown in years. By the time the court was dismissed, Joffrey had grown testy, snapping at a few final petitioners before storming away to the Solar for refreshment. In the Solar, a light midday meal had been laid out. A pitcher of watered wine, fresh bread, cold meats, and fruit tarts. Margaery followed Joffrey, pressing a cup into his hands. "Drink, my king," she murmured. "You must be thirsty after sitting on that throne so long." He drank, scowling, letting the cool liquid temper his annoyance. Cersei and Tywin arrived soon after. Tywin wasted no time. "Your Grace, I trust you understand that we have made a significant diplomatic concession. Lady Lysa's demands for neutrality might embolden her to meddle in ways we cannot foresee. Still, ensuring the Vale does not join our enemies is paramount." Joffrey shrugged. "As long as she doesn't try to cross me, I don't care. The Vale is just a pile of rocks. Cersei interjected, "Yes, but a formidable pile of rocks. Don't underestimate them, my sweet boy." She cast a suspicious glance at Marjorie, who was refilling Joffrey's cup. "We should consider sending someone to the Eyrie to confirm Lady Lisa's intentions." Marjorie smiled serenely. "A raven might suffice, unless your grace wishes to show them personal attention. It could be a gesture that fosters trust." She spoke as if Joffrey's presence would be received gratefully, though all in the room knew that the Vale's lady might not be so easily charmed by Joffrey's theatrics. Joffrey scoffed, "I've no interest in a trip to the mountains. Let them come to me if they want to talk further." With that, he drained his cup and stormed out, calling for his Kingsguard to follow. The door slammed behind him. A cold silence followed his departure. Tywin, lips pressed together in a thin line, finally turned to Marjorie. "Your skill in calming him is commendable, Your Grace." The compliment was grudgingly offered, but Marjorie accepted it with a polite bow of her head. Cersei bristled, not quite disguising the resentment in her voice. "Indeed, commendable." She offered no further praise. The interplay did not go unnoticed by Marjorie, who remained as graceful as ever. She excused herself, citing preparations for the next charity function she planned with Septa Eglantine. Tywin and Cersei watched her leave, neither speaking. The tension between them was different in nature. Tywin saw Marjorie as an asset to be carefully harnessed, while Cersei saw her as a rival for Joffrey's affections and a threat to her own influence. They both wanted to maintain a strong Lannister hold on power. They simply had different methods. Meanwhile, word of the new accord with the Vale spread quickly. Lords throughout King's Landing speculated on how it might shift the political landscape. Would the Vale remain truly neutral, or could the cunning minds behind it, like Peter Baelish, rumored to have Lady Lisa's ear, use the alliance to outmaneuver the Lannisters? Peter had departed the capital some time ago, supposedly to arrange a match in the Vale, but rumors circulated that his ambitions ran deeper. Within the Red Keep, daily life continued. Servants lit candles at dusk, cleaned the corridors, and carried messages. Nobles gossiped in corner alcoves, discussing the king's moods and the queen's charitable visits. Tyrion pored over ledgers in his solar, wrestling with figures and debts. Jaime tried to hone his skills with a training sword, left-handed, though every attempt reminded him of his lost hand. Sansa tried to remain invisible, wandering the gardens only when she believed no one would follow her, head bowed beneath a web of sorrow. And somewhere in the labyrinth of secret passageways, Varys continued to spin webs of information. One bright morning, Marjorie decided that the king should show the people his generosity more openly. She suggested a grand parade through the city, distributing alms to orphans and poor families. Joffrey at first was bored by the idea, but then he seized upon the chance to put on a show. He declared that a host of gold cloaks would accompany them, along with trumpeters and criers, so everyone would see him in his glory. Marjorie made sure the parade would stop at several carefully chosen points, including the orphanage she had arranged to fund, as well as a sept known for its closeness with the Tyrells. On the appointed day, the streets were lined with curious onlookers. Marjorie rode beside the king in an open litter, waving demurely at the crowd. Joffrey wore a golden crown adorned with rubies, and a fine doublet of crimson velvet. He sat rigidly, bestowing condescending looks upon the masses. Guards flanked them, halberds in hand. The city had been tidied for the occasion. Fresh rushes, banners, and ribbons of Lannister crimson and Tyrell green fluttered in the wind. Street children gathered around baskets of bread distributed by Marjorie's servants. For a moment, the capital seemed to be in a festive mood, though one could never wholly banish the stench of the cramped alleys. As they passed through Cobbler's Square, cheers erupted. Some older folk and mothers with children dropped to their knees, blessing the king and queen. Joffrey smiled, though the expression did not reach his eyes. He tossed a few silver stags from his litter, smirking when the small folk scrambled to snatch them. Marjorie leaned forward, calling for her maids to hand out more coin. She wanted the people to associate prosperity and kindness with the crown, and by extension with the Tyrells and Lannisters united. At one stop, a particularly bold child, a girl of perhaps 8 or 9, stepped forward to present the queen with a wilted flower. She mumbled a thanks for the bread, eyes downcast. Margaery accepted the flower graciously, praising the girl's bravery. She invited Joffrey to say a word or two. The king scowled, but with the crowd watching, he managed a curt, "Well done, child," before ordering the parade to continue. Still, the image of a benevolent royal pair spread among the crowd. Bards would sing of how King Joffrey and Queen Margaery distributed mercy and kindness, illusions though they might be. Yet illusions can change perceptions, and perceptions can shape reality, at least temporarily. A gentler image of Joffrey began to filter through parts of the city, diluting his more monstrous reputation. While not everyone was fooled, some of the small folk began to speak of the king's generosity. "The boy has a queen who's taught him well," some would say, while others muttered, "He's still a Lannister. We'll see how long this lasts." That question, how long would it last, echoed across King's Landing and beyond. In the days following the parade, no further attempts on Joffrey's life came to light, though rumors churned in the background. Those who had plotted his murder at the wedding wondered if another opportunity might present itself. Lady Olenna, though not openly admitting her role to anyone, certainly did not want her granddaughter shackled to a monster for all time. Peter Baelish, from his vantage point, was not finished with his broader schemes. Even Varys, who prided himself on the realm's well-being, maintained careful neutrality, uncertain which direction would lead to the greater good. Meanwhile, across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen continued her conquests in Slaver's Bay, though news of such events reached King's Landing only in bits and pieces. In the north, the Bolton's grip tightened, and the Ironborn looked for opportunities to raid the coastline. On Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon listened to the whispered promises of the Red Priestess, believing the Iron Throne was his destiny. And in Dorne, House Martell nursed old grudges. All the while, the Lannister hold on power rested upon the uneasy cooperation of Tyrell gold and harvests, and the slender hope that Joffrey would not destroy everything in a moment of madness. That moment nearly arrived on a brisk evening, late in the year, when the king hosted a feast to welcome a delegation from the Iron Bank of Bravos. The crown's debts were steep, and the Lannisters had no choice but to negotiate. Tywin had arranged the meeting, ensuring that the famed institution sent envoys to discuss a restructuring of loans. The plan was to reassure the bankers that the crown was stable and that repayment was inevitable. The risk was that if the Iron Bank deemed the Lannisters untrustworthy, they might fund a rival claimant. Dinner took place in a smaller, private hall, decorated with tapestries depicting Lannister victories. The Bravosi envoys arrived dressed in dark finery, their manner polite but guarded. Tywin presided over the meal with chilly courtesy, while Joffrey, seated at the head of the table, exhibited a restlessness that put everyone on edge. Margaery, to his right, attempted to steer conversation toward pleasant topics: the might of Bravos' Titan, the wealth of their trade routes, the cultural achievements of the free city. Partway through the meal, one of the envoys, a severe man named Noho Dimidus, inquired about the crown's plan for long-term repayment. "We have heard rumors," he said with a thin-lipped smile, "that the crown's gold mines have run dry." Joffrey bristled, nearly rising from his seat. "How dare you?" His voice echoed through the hall. "My house is the wealthiest in the realm. We can pay our debts." Tywin placed a calming hand on the table. "Your Grace, please, allow me to reassure our guests in a more detailed manner." He turned to Noho Dimidus. "The crown, through the union of House Lannister and House Tyrell, remains fully capable of meeting its obligations. The Tyrell harvests and trade concessions will ensure steady revenue. We will discuss the specifics on the morrow." Joffrey was not mollified. The indignation in his eyes burned. The idea that anyone would question the crown's solvency enraged him. A hush fell over the table. Margaery quickly signaled for a servant to refill Joffrey's cup, hoping to quell his outburst, but Joffrey had latched onto the notion of disrespect. "You, Bravosi, dare come into my hall and question my wealth?" Joffrey said, voice shaking. Do you know how easily I could have you all thrown into the dungeons? He looked around wildly, searching for some sign of support. Jaime, at his post by the wall, froze in dismay. Tyrion watched with alarm, eyes flicking to Tywin. Marjorie grasped Joffrey's forearm, her voice soothing. Your Grace, they mean no offense. This is business, and we must keep a cool head. Noho Dimitis bowed slightly, though his expression remained pointed. We ask these questions because it is the Iron Bank's duty to protect its investments. Your Grace, I intended no insult. Joffrey's lips curled. Maybe I should burn that titan of yours to the ground and see how you like that. He gave a cruel laugh. Tywin cleared his throat with a sound like a breaking branch, forcibly steering the conversation away. The crown has no quarrel with bravos, as long as we are met with fair terms. My grandson's words are born of, but Joffrey interrupted, slamming a hand on the table. Plates rattled. The sudden movement caused Marjorie to jolt. No, let them hear me. These bankers think they can insult us because they've heard rumors. Maybe I'll send the royal fleet across the narrow sea and lay siege to their precious city if they deny us courtesy. The Bravosi envoys exchanged a glance. One coughed. The other pressed his lips together in a faint grimace. Tywin shot Joffrey a warning glare, but the king was in a full fury now. It was Marjorie who took charge. With a voice as sweet as honey, she turned to the envoys, ignoring Joffrey's outburst. Gentlemen, I assure you that, in the spirit of alliance, we will find a suitable solution. This feast is to honor your presence. Let us not sour it with misunderstandings. She stood, gracefully lifting a wine cup, a toast to the continued friendship between King's Landing and Bravos. The shift in tone was palpable. Awkwardly, the envoys stood, cups in hand. Tywin signaled for everyone to rise. Joffrey, face red with anger, reluctantly stood but refused to drink. The tension lingered like a foul scent in the air. After that, conversation dwindled, and the meal concluded swiftly, with Tywin escorting the Bravosi envoys away to calmer discussion. Joffrey stormed out, Marjorie trailing behind him, trying to placate his temper with kind words. Tyrion watched, a sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew that incidents like this would erode any confidence the Iron Bank might have in the crown. Tywin could do damage control, but it was becoming clear that Joffrey was an unpredictable menace. So long as he lived, the realm danced on the edge of a knife. After the disastrous feast, Tywin convened a late-night meeting his inner circle in a private council chamber. He summoned Tyrion, Cersei, and Marjorie, along with Pycelle and a few key figures. Notably absent was Joffrey. The king had been persuaded to retire, thanks to a hefty dose of wine and Marjorie's gentle insistence. Once everyone had assembled, Tywin's stern gaze swept the table. We have a problem, he said succinctly. The king's behavior undermined our negotiations tonight. I have managed to salvage enough goodwill that the Iron Bank will continue talks in the morning, but they are not blind to the king's temper. Cersei stiffened. He is my son. You speak as though he is a calamity. Tywin's stare did not waver. He may become one if he continues in this vein. We need to manage him more effectively. Marjorie spoke softly, hands folded on her lap. He listens to me sometimes, my lord. I can try to prevent such outbursts, but I cannot change his nature entirely. Tyrion let out a measured sigh. Perhaps we can arrange these meetings so that Joffrey does not attend. He has little interest in finances. Father, you could handle the negotiations, and then present them to the king as a fait accompli. Cersei scowled. He is the king. He will demand his presence where he sees fit. Tywin's mouth curved into the faintest frown. Indeed, we must tread carefully. Appearances are paramount, but in the interim we will reduce the need for him to attend. Marjorie, you must keep him occupied. Indulge him. Let him plan hunts, feasts, anything that keeps him out of these crucial dealings. I will finalize the details with the Bravosi myself. Marjorie nodded. I will do my best. Pycelle, shifting in his seat, offered a shaky comment about how the king's moods might be soothed by certain tonics. But the Lannisters paid him little heed. They were planning around Joffrey, as though he were a loaded crossbow that could go off at any time. The irony did not escape Tyrion. When the meeting ended, Margaery walked back through the halls toward the royal apartments. Her mind churned. The illusions she had built around Joffrey were fragile. So long as he played the role of a generous king, she could maintain some influence. But the seeds of cruelty he held within were already sprouting. She feared that soon, nothing would stop him from another public, damning incident. As she ascended the stairs, she felt a strange mix of resolve and unease. She had pledged to be queen, to unite the realm, to stand beside this boy king. But if he became a danger too great to contain, Margaery wondered how far she would be willing to go for the greater good. In a dark corridor, alone, Varys watched her pass, his expression unreadable. The Master of Whisperers had heard the rumors of the Purple Wedding's failed poisoning and had his own suspicions about who was responsible. He harbored no illusions about Joffrey's capacity for harm, nor about the ambitions of others. But for now, he simply watched and listened, letting the great game unfold. He told himself he served the realm, and the realm required stability. If that stability demanded new alliances or new rulers, so be it. For the moment, however, Joffrey Baratheon was king, and Margaery Tyrell his queen. Their union was either a bulwark against chaos or a ticking clock counting down to a tragedy of unprecedented scale. Weeks passed. The Iron Bank negotiations proceeded behind closed doors, with Tywin skillfully placating the envoys, offering incremental payments from newly arranged loans tied to the Tyrell fortunes. Joffrey was kept largely preoccupied with hunts in the Kingswood and lavish dinners that massaged his ego. Margaery remained at his side, orchestrating each event so it served the dual purpose of entertaining Joffrey and maintaining a semblance of royal charity. The city's mood was cautiously optimistic. Food was more plentiful, gold circulated more freely, and the king was less inclined to roam the streets with violence on his mind. A superficial peace seemed to settle. But beneath that veneer, tension mounted. The small council received reports that Stannis' forces had grown bolder, raiding small coastal villages to test their defenses. The Ironborn, too, were restless under their self-styled king, Balon Greyjoy. Tywin recognized that any perceived weakness at the heart of the realm would invite attack. To shore up their position, he pushed for more alliances, more betrothals. He dispatched envoys to Dorne, seeking to mend old wounds with House Martell and perhaps arrange a royal visit. Oberyn Martell had been killed in King's Landing, under different circumstances, in another timeline, but perhaps here or soon to come, and the Martells simmered with quiet rage. Winning them over would not be simple. The Lannisters also kept a wary eye on the north. The Boltons had declared for the Iron Throne, but pockets of resistance, namely the Ironborn in Moat Cailin and scattered Stark loyalists, complicated matters. Rumors of a young girl claiming to be Arya Stark had reached Tywin's ears. The situation was so fluid that Tywin decided to maintain a defensive posture rather than risk sending the bulk of the royal forces north. Joffrey, uninterested in such subtleties, did not attend most war councils, which was a small mercy for those who did. In the Red Keep, Margaery grew more adept at handling Joffrey's moods. She coaxed him with promises of glory, praising his every small act of decency as though it were a triumph. He was not wholly fooled. He could sense her manipulations at times, but he liked the attention. He enjoyed being told he was wise, kind, and powerful. So he allowed her a measure of influence, rationalizing that she was his wife, his property, and that her successes reflected well on him. His public cruelty diminished somewhat, but privately, he vented his sadistic urges. Servants whispered of bruises on certain maids or hounds that had been beaten for no reason. Margaery walked a tightrope. She kept him from the worst atrocities in the public eye but could not protect everyone within the keep. One day, after a heated argument over something trivial, a slight delay in the arrival of a promised shipment of Arbor gold, Joffrey struck Margaery in their chambers. The back of his hand caught her cheek, sending her reeling to the floor. He loomed over her, chest heaving, rage twisting his features. For a moment, She saw the raw malice that he kept mostly caged. Fear coiled in her stomach, but she forced herself to remain composed. She rose, tears shimmering in her eyes, and gently touched his arm. "You are my king," she whispered. "I am yours to command. But please, my love, do not hurt me." She played the part of the submissive wife, all the while her mind raced, cold and calculating. Joffrey's anger dissipated under the wave of her apparent submission. He muttered a half-hearted apology, something about the day's frustrations, and stormed out. Marjorie sank onto the bed, pressing a trembling hand to her bruised cheek. She did not cry. She only stared at the door where he had vanished, the spark of resolve growing in her. This was her future if she remained by his side without recourse. She remembered her grandmother's warnings, remembered the carefully laid plans that had once been set in motion at the purple wedding. They had failed then, but if the threat of Joffrey remained, how long before he lashed out at her in a way she could not manipulate? How long before he destroyed House Tyrell's standing, or turned the people against him so viciously that chaos reigned? That same night, she received a coded note from Olenna Tyrell. It arrived with a servant bearing a bouquet of fresh roses. Slipped between the petals was a scrap of parchment. Marjorie recognized the handwriting immediately, her grandmother's. The note read simply, "We must speak." Marjorie burnt the note after reading it, her heart pounding. Lady Olenna had left King's Landing weeks ago, returning to Highgarden. If she insisted on a secret meeting, it meant only one thing. Marjorie's eyes flicked to the bruise on her cheek in the mirror. She would not let Joffrey drag her, and the Tyrells, into ruin. One way or another, the realm would be spared from another Mad King. In the days that followed, Marjorie pleaded with Joffrey for a short journey to visit her grandmother at a minor family estate near the Reach. She framed it as a chance for the king to show his devotion to his new family, to secure their farmland yields more thoroughly for King's Landing. Tyrion quietly supported the idea, seeing it as an opportunity for the king to be away from the city while the Iron Bank deals were finalized. Tywin, too, had no objection, as long as Joffrey's absence was not prolonged. He was busy with negotiations and the complexities of the realm, and if Marjorie could keep Joffrey occupied, so much the better. Cersei, however, was suspicious. She did not like the thought of her son traveling without her. But Joffrey, seeking fresh excitement, overruled his mother. The king had begun to grow weary of the capital's routine, and he fancied a ride into the countryside, perhaps some hunts, and a display of feudal loyalty from the lesser lords who would line the roads to greet him. Thus, a royal party was assembled. Jaime Lannister led part of the Kingsguard, riding in shining armor despite his missing hand. Marjorie traveled in a luxurious litter, with various ladies-in-waiting and servants. Joffrey rode at the head of the column, flanked by his gold cloaks and a handful of Tyrell knights who had remained in the city as part of Marjorie's retinue. The journey took them through the lush fields and gentle hills of the Reach, a land of plenty compared to the harsher environs around King's Landing. Everywhere they went, the local peasants bowed and offered small gifts, fresh produce, flowers, sometimes small crafts. Joffrey would accept them with an imperious nod, sometimes flicking a coin at their feet. After several days of travel, they approached the estate where Lady Olenna waited. It was a sprawling manor surrounded by rose gardens, overshadowed by the majesty of Highgarden further down the Mander, but still impressive. Banners of House Tyrell fluttered in the gentle breeze. Olenna Tyrell herself stood at the entrance, attended by a small household retinue. She greeted the king with a careful blend of humility and grandmotherly affection, praising his most handsome countenance and welcoming him to her humble abode. Joffrey, enthralled by the deference, smirked and strutted inside, asking for wine and amusements. That evening, a feast was held in a modest but well-appointed hall. The courses were sumptuous: fresh trout, spiced lamb, honeyed cakes, and the atmosphere seemed convivial enough. Yet beneath every polite smile and bit of small talk lurked unspoken tensions. Olenna was all graciousness as she spoke to Joffrey, skillfully sidestepping his more barbed comments. Marjorie watched the interplay closely, knowing her grandmother had a keen mind for details. At the night's conclusion, Joffrey retired to his chambers, under guard but free to roam the manor as he pleased. Marjorie and Olenna found a private moment to speak in a small solar. Olenna's face was lined with concern as she closed the door behind them. She motioned for Marjorie to sit. "Child, you're bruised," she said softly, brushing Marjorie's cheek with gnarled fingers. "So it's as bad as I feared." Marjorie nodded once, swallowing a rise of emotion in her throat. "He struck me. It could have been worse." Her grandmother's eyes hardened. "No, it must not continue." She drew closer, speaking in hushed tones. "The plan we laid at the wedding. Someone interfered, or the fates themselves conspired to keep that wretch alive. We cannot suffer him to wreak havoc upon our house, or upon you. Not again." Marjorie clasped her hands together to steady them. "His temper grows worse by the day. I can only mitigate so much. If he continues like this, the realm may face war again, internal strife, or a coalition of enemies that see his madness as an opportunity. Grandfather Tywin will not tolerate Joffrey's behavior indefinitely, either." Olenna's lips pressed tight. "Tywin Lannister. Humph. He is formidable, but he won't move against his own blood lightly. That leaves us to act. Do you still have the confidence of the king's household? Your ladies, your guards?" "Yes," Marjorie answered. "I've chosen them carefully. A few have been with me since Highgarden. They are loyal. And Tyrion? Do you trust him?" Olenna's brow arched. Marjorie considered. "He is no friend to Joffrey, but I do not think he would openly conspire to kill his nephew. He's too cautious, and besides, Tywin would never forgive him if caught. It must be done quietly. We must see it through, and soon." He grows suspicious more easily of late. A ghost of a sigh escaped Olenna's lips. Poison can be swift and sure if done properly. She pulled a small vial from within her robes, holding it out. The strangler was used before, hidden in Sansa Stark's hairnet. That night's chaos prevented it from working properly, or we miscalculated the switch of the cups. Regardless, this is another mixture, one that will leave him gasping within moments. Even the best maesters cannot save him. We need only find the right opportunity. Marjorie took the vial, feeling the cool glass press against her palm. "We must be certain no one suspects us. The Tyrell name must remain unsullied. And Olenna squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "I know, child. We will be careful. I have experience in these matters. Do what must be done." They parted soon after, both well aware of the gravity of their decision. Their conversation had lasted mere minutes, but the implications would echo for generations. In her chambers that night, Marjorie stared at the vial, a storm of emotions raging within her. She was no stranger to political maneuvering, marrying Renly, forging alliances, but regicide was a different matter. Yet, as she pressed a hand to her bruised cheek, she felt no hesitation. If the king would destroy them, they would destroy him first. The next morning, the estate buzzed with life. Joffrey woke in high spirits, apparently delighted by the docile courtesy of his Tyrell hosts. He demanded a tour of the rose gardens after breaking his fast. Olenna obliged, walking with him through vine-covered trellises, pointing out rare blooms. Marjorie lingered at his side, smiling whenever he looked at her. She noted the stable boys carefully grooming the king's horse, the women carrying trays of sweetmeats, each detail orchestrated by Olenna. The hush of anticipation built. When midday approached, Olenna suggested a final feast before the king's departure, something small but refined, to honor his gracious visit. Joffrey, never one to turn down a lavish meal, agreed. The main hall was quickly prepared with fresh linens, arrangements of roses, and a centerpiece dish of roasted swan. Gold and green banners hung overhead. Servants hustled between the kitchen and the dining area, ensuring no plate was out of place. Jaime Lannister inspected the security arrangements, though he had grown somewhat lax, believing this trip to be a mere courtesy call. As guests gathered, Joffrey took his seat at the head of the table, Marjorie to his right, Olenna on his left. Various Tyrell cousins and knights filled the other seats. Wine was poured, toasts given. The atmosphere was light-hearted, almost joyful. The only hint of strain lay in Marjorie's forced smile and Olenna's watchful gaze. Course after course arrived. Spiced pears, pomegranate salad, succulent duck, sweet pastries stuffed with cheese and figs. Joffrey ate heartily, occasionally demanding the servants bring more. At one point, he dripped gravy on his doublet and roared for a napkin, which Marjorie dutifully provided. As the feast neared its end, Olenna proposed one final toast. She rose, raising her goblet of arbor gold. To our king, may his reign be long, prosperous, and ever in bloom, like the flowers of High Garden. A murmur of agreement passed around the table. Joffrey, standing, lifted his own cup. In that moment, Marjorie's heart pounded. She knew the plan hinged upon ensuring his final cup contained the poison. Would the exchange work? Would the servants who had replaced the wine do so without error? Joffrey tipped his goblet to his lips. He drank. The seconds seemed to stretch into hours. Marjorie forced herself to feign a radiant smile. Olenna watched closely, every muscle tense. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Joffrey set his cup down, licked his lips, and opened his mouth to speak. Then he wheezed, a rough, unnatural sound. He lifted a hand to his throat, confusion and anger contorting his features. A hush fell over the hall. "Your Grace," Marjorie asked, feigning concern. She reached for him. He coughed once, a harsh bark, then again. His eyes bulged in panic. He tried to draw breath, but the poison was already at work, constricting his airway. A gurgling rasp escaped him. Chairs scraped the floor as guests jumped to their feet. Panic surged. Olenna gasped theatrically. "He's choking." Jaime and the Kingsguard rushed forward. Joffrey staggered, knocking dishes to the floor. His face began to turn purple, eyes red with burst vessels. He clasped at Marjorie's dress, a desperate, feral look in his eyes. Then he dropped to his knees, retching. A hush of horror fell over everyone. Marjorie sank to the floor beside him, sobbing, though tears did not fill her eyes. "Someone help him!" she cried, playing the role to perfection. A wave of confusion and chaos rippled through the hall. "Help my husband!" The king clawed at his throat one last time. Then his body spasmed, and with a strangled croak, he collapsed. Silence. Servants stared in shock. Knights hovered, unsure of what to do. Jaime turned to Marjorie, face pale. He knelt, pressing 2 fingers to Joffrey's neck, as if checking for a pulse. He found none. The color drained from Jaime's face. Marjorie let out a scream, rocking back as though grief had overwhelmed her. Olenna, trembling, sank into a chair, murmuring, "The king is dead, oh gods!" The entire hall erupted in terrified cries. Some dropped to their knees, others scrambled away. The king's guard circled Joffrey's body, swords half drawn, as though expecting some enemy to appear. But there was no visible foe, only a breathless hush and the corpse of the boy king, twisted in death. In that moment, the realm changed. Marjorie felt a cold wave wash over her. It was done. All around her, guests panicked, staff ran for the maesters, Jaime barked orders. But she knew the truth. House Tyrell had finally succeeded in ending the reign of King Joffrey Baratheon. And though the immediate aftermath would be chaos, she felt a grim certainty that the 7 kingdoms might stand a chance at a more stable future. She let her tears flow at last, feigned heartbreak a perfect mask for the resolution that lay beneath. From the dais, Olenna stared down at her, face etched with sorrow and relief in equal measure. Even as the entire manor erupted into confusion, Marjorie reminded herself of the next steps. The blame must fall elsewhere. An assassin, a shadow of an old enemy, anything but the Tyrells. She clung to Olenna's instructions, stepping into the role of the bereaved widow. Meanwhile, Jaime Lannister cradled his dead sister's son, shock and sorrow contorting his features. Word would soon reach Tywin, Cersei, Tyrion, and the entire realm. Joffrey was gone. And with his death, the story of the Seven Kingdoms would veer off onto yet another uncertain path. The stage was set for new conflicts, fresh alliances, and the old question of who wow. LD rule. For now, though, all that existed in the hall was the hush of realization, and Marjorie's whispered prayer for forgiveness to the stranger who had come to claim the Boy King at last. Chaos gripped the Tyrell estate's great hall in the heartbeat after Joffrey Baratheon's final, choking gasp. Servants dropped platters of fruit and flagons of wine in their panic, and half the assembled guests were on their feet, eyes wide with horror as the king crumpled to the polished floor. Marjorie, on her knees, let out a raw, anguished wail. She pressed a trembling hand to Joffrey's chest, as if to rouse him, but his purpled face and the vacant stare of his eyes made it clear that he was gone. Nearby, Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, looked on with practiced dismay, pressing a lace handkerchief to her mouth. In truth, her pulse thundered with the knowledge that their plan had succeeded, yet she wore the impeccable mask of a shocked court lady. Jaime Lannister was the first of the Kingsguard to kneel at Joffrey's side. He had drawn his sword, but there was no visible assailant to punish, only the lifeless body of his sister's son. Glancing around with his one good hand gripping his blade, Jaime's horror mingled with confusion. Less than a year earlier, Joffrey had narrowly escaped death at his wedding feast in King's Landing, surviving a near poisoning that no one had ever fully explained. Now, in the Tyrell heartlands, far from the machinations of the Red Keep, fate or conspiracy had struck him down at last. Jaime stared at Marjorie's tear-streaked face, suspecting she had no reason to kill the king, yet her posture at his side carried no hint of relief. She seemed every inch the grieving widow. Shouts echoed across the hall. Several Tyrell bannermen pressed closer, forming a ring around the dais in hopes of defending the queen and Lady Olenna from some unknown threat. Others rushed to bar the doors, though no assassin emerged from behind the arras or beneath the table. The king's own retinue of Lannister guards gathered in confusion, uncertain whether they should suspect the Tyrells or someone else entirely. Wine still dribbled from overfilled goblets. The air reeked of roasted swan and lamp oil from the candelabra, and the stunned hush of fear and disbelief pressed on every soul present. Marjorie's voice quavered. He was drinking wine. He choked. Someone get the maester, please. Her words rang with desperation, as if she clung to a last thread of hope that the king might be saved. The performance was for the benefit of any watchers who might doubt her grief. A handful of men and women sprinted toward the estate's inner corridors, shouting for a maester. Yet all the healers in the world could not revive Joffrey now. Jaime set a hand on Joffrey's chest, half expecting to feel a heartbeat. Instead, he felt only the stillness of cooling flesh. Sorrow and shock twisted through him. Though Joffrey had been a cruel boy and a tyrannical king, he was also Jaime's secret son, born of incest with Cersei. Despite Jaime's revulsion at Joffrey's cruelty, the finality of his death cut deeper than he could have imagined. Slowly, Jaime lifted his gaze to Marjorie, who rose unsteadily to her feet, her gown stained with spilled wine and Joffrey's vomit. He saw no triumph in her tear-blurred eyes, only a pained confusion that seemed sincere. Another possibility chilled him. If she or her family had arranged this, she was a more capable liar than he had thought. Around them, the frenzy of the hall reached a crescendo. A few ladies fainted. One of Marjorie's cousins gagged at the sight of the king's contorted body. Conflicting shouts filled the air. "Fetch the maester! Lock the gates! Gods preserve us! Where is the assassin? Protect the queen!" At last, a pair of Tyrell guards approached Jaime and bowed stiffly. "Sir Jaime," one said, clearing his throat, "we must see to her grace's safety." He glanced at Marjorie, who stood trembling, arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes were glassy. She looked as though she might collapse from shock. Jaime paused, torn between guarding his nephew's corpse and safeguarding the new widow. Finally, he gently laid Joffrey's body down, closing those vacant eyes, and then rose. He motioned for two of the Lannister guards to remain behind with the king's remains while he and the other Kingsguard escorted Marjorie away from the chaos. Olenna offered an arm to her granddaughter, and the pair followed Jaime toward one of the smaller adjoining rooms, while the rest of the retinue argued about how best to secure the manor. Within moments, the king's corpse was surrounded by a knot of people. Lannister men, Tyrell stewards, the estate's household guard, all jostling to see if they could glean any hint of the cause. Someone overturned the goblets at Joffrey's place, sniffing for poison. Another pointed to leftover slices of lemon cake, to the carved swan. More than a few eyes flicked suspiciously at the Tyrell servers who had poured the wine. Whispers of poison rippled through the air. While any death mid-feast might be called choking, Joffrey's gnarled face and the fact that he'd survived a known poisoning attempt before made everyone suspect the worst. Upstairs, in a quiet solar, Olenna guided Margaery to a cushioned chair. The old woman's sharp eyes never stopped scanning the shadows, as if expecting eavesdroppers or hidden watchers behind every tapestry. Jaime barred the door, while two Kingsguard took up positions outside. The hush that fell in that room was uncanny after the din of the hall. Margaery perched on the edge of the chair, trembling with equal parts shock and adrenaline. Her eyes flicked to Jaime, who stood by the window, looking out over the Tyrell estate's manicured gardens as if searching for a phantom threat. Olenna, with stooped shoulders, lowered herself onto a bench and pressed her lace handkerchief to her face once more. Jaime spoke first, voice hoarse. "Someone just murdered the king, in the heart of your grandmother's hall. I trust you both realize what this implies." Margaery's lips parted in an attempt at words, but she only managed a quavering exhale. Olenna, however, was composed enough to reply. "We are not so lost in grief as to miss the implications, Ser Jaime. The question is who would have cause to do this now, and why?" "They'll suspect House Tyrell," Jaime said flatly, turning to face them. His expression was grim, eyes haunted. Joffrey was never beloved, but if a king dies while visiting the Tyrells, the court in King's Landing will look for the culprit among the hosts. Olenna gave a faint shake of her head. "Or they'll blame House Martell or the Ironborn or the remains of the Starks. There's a whole realm of suspects." Her voice remained steady, almost too steady. She kept her face angled toward Jaime, careful not to meet Margaery's gaze. "We mustn't jump to the assumption that the blame will fall solely on us." Jaime's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, though with his right hand gone, the gesture looked awkward. "You should pray the investigation finds some outsider to pin this on, because if Cersei believes your family orchestrated this, the Seven Kingdoms will descend into chaos. My father, Tywin, will not stand for this either." An uneasy stillness followed. Margaery tried to calm the frantic pounding of her heart. This was what she and Olenna had planned. She had known the end of Joffrey would not come quietly, not without repercussions. Yet the reality of it, the body lying downstairs, the swirl of immediate suspicion, and Jaime's pained presence all combined to remind her that she was walking a razor's edge. One misstep and war would erupt, war worse than any they had seen since the War of the Five Kings. She swallowed hard and managed to speak, letting her voice tremble with emotion. "I don't understand how this could happen. He was happy this morning. He ate so heartily. Perhaps it was an accident. Could it have been a piece of bone stuck in his throat?" Even as she spoke, she heard the hollow note of the lie. Jaime studied her face, then exhaled slowly. "I doubt we'll be able to claim it was just an accident. Not with what happened at his wedding feast, not with the realm in its present state. Everyone will suspect poison, Margaery. Everyone." He paused, controlling the edge in his voice. "And the first person who'll suspect it is my sister." Margaery's stomach twisted. Cersei Lannister had never hidden her disdain for Margaery or for the Tyrells. Once this news reached King's Landing, Cersei would tear the city apart looking for a culprit. She had been paranoid even when Joffrey was alive. The death of her firstborn would unleash the worst in her. Margaery could almost hear the Queen Regent's screams of vengeance echoing through the Red Keep. Olenna set her handkerchief in her lap. "We must proceed with caution, Ser Jaime, for your own sake as well as ours. The realm cannot survive another open war, and if the Lannisters make open accusations against House Tyrell, or vice versa, it will undo all that was gained by this alliance." Jaime crossed his arms, looking strangely vulnerable. "I care about the realm," he said, voice subdued. "But I also care about Cersei. This will destroy her." Marjorie suppressed a surge of guilt. She had known Joffrey's death would devastate his mother. But the realm's danger had been too great to let his rule continue. It was a harsh calculus. She had weighed thousands of lives against the fury of one mother. Even so, the thought of Cersei's grief made her uneasy. There would be no limit to Cersei's thirst for vengeance. Logic would not soften her rage. Before anyone else could speak, a faint knock sounded at the door. Jaime drew his sword, motioning for Olenna and Marjorie to stay back. When he cracked the door open, a steward stood there, trembling from head to toe. "Sir Jaime," the man said in a quavering voice, "Maester Fimmel has arrived to examine the king, and some of the men wish to know if they should ride to Highgarden at once for reinforcements. Many fear retaliation from the Lannister forces that might come." Jaime's mouth twitched in frustration. "Tell them no one is riding anywhere yet. Let the maester do his work. We'll handle the rest afterward." He almost shut the door, then paused, grimacing. "Send my own man, Ser Loras Tyrell, to me if he's available." The steward hastened away, and Jaime looked back at Olenna and Marjorie. "We need to keep everyone calm. No one goes anywhere until we establish the truth of what happened." Marjorie rose from the chair, smoothing her skirt, though her hands still shook. "I'll speak to my ladies, see if we can keep the household from panic." "Grandmother?" Olenna stood as well, inclining her head. "I will speak with my stewards. I have known them for decades. I'll see that the staff remains cooperative. We'll keep them from fueling any gossip that might spark a riot." Jaime let them go, though it was clear from his clenched jaw that he disliked the idea of them scattering. Yet to keep them locked in that solar would accomplish nothing. He told them both, "Stay within these walls, remain visible. I'll do the same. No one must think you're hiding." He left to check on the chaos in the main hall, while Olenna and Marjorie slipped away to gather the ladies of the household. The corridors were alive with hushed voices. Groups of servants huddled near doorways, whispering guesses and conspiracies. A few stared openly at Marjorie as she passed, pity in their eyes for the poor queen, widowed so soon after her wedding. She tried to maintain a regal composure, though internally, she was counting the steps. Each footfall took her farther from that hall, and from Joffrey's corpse, and each step reminded her that she had crossed a line from which she could never return. Word spread swiftly across the Reach. Before the day was out, riders had been dispatched to Highgarden with urgent messages for Lord Mace Tyrell. One messenger galloped toward King's Landing with news for the hand of the king, Tywin Lannister, and for the Queen Regent. The unstoppable wave of rumor and fact would sweep through the realm within days, if not sooner. Marjorie could do nothing but brace herself. That evening, after the estate's maester confirmed that no simple accident had befallen the king, a council of sorts convened in a cramped meeting chamber on the estate's second floor. Jaime was there, along with Olenna, Marjorie, Ser Loras Tyrell, and a handful of trusted retainers from both Tyrell and Lannister loyalists. The maester, a hunched old man with watery eyes, reported that King Joffrey's throat showed signs of something far more sinister than a stray bone. "Poison," the old man said bluntly, his hands trembling around the folded cloth he held. "He was choking, yes, but under the skin I see blackening consistent with certain toxins that restrict the airways. His mouth and lips, there is no doubt. We've thoroughly examined the table, the food, the wine. We found no single item that conclusively reveals the substance. The king's personal goblet smelled faintly of something metallic, but even that is inconclusive. Poisoners can be cunning, my lords, my ladies." A grim silence followed. Jaime, arms crossed, let out a ragged breath. Loras Tyrell's eyes flicked from his grandmother's impassive face to Marjorie's mournful posture. He wore a mixture of anger and shock, but not necessarily suspicion. He wanted answers as badly as anyone. Olenna, letting her voice waver with age and sorrow, asked, "Have you any notion who might have done this?" The maester shook his head. "None, my lady. I am but a physician, and I know no more of the intrigues of the court than a field mouse knows of the falcon's flight. I can only confirm that it was poison." Jaime dismissed the maester. Once the old man departed, the hush grew heavier. One of the Lannister men, Ser Osmond Kettleblack, newly assigned to guard detail, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, Ser Jaime, Lady Olenna, but we need to decide how to proceed. Word is already spreading. We can't keep this quiet." Loras Tyrell, handsome features tight with anger, ran a hand through his brown curls. "We have to investigate. Every servant in that hall, every traveling bard, every merchant that's been in or out of these gates in the last few days. Someone must have smuggled the poison here." His grandmother offered him a pinched smile. "My dear, that may be a start, but that net could take weeks to sift through. By then, the realm will be in chaos. King's Landing will want answers far sooner, and heads will roll if we cannot provide them." At that, Jaime turned to Marjorie. "Your Grace, do you remember anything unusual at table? Anyone pouring the wine who did not belong?" She lifted her face, eyes reddened. The day's events had drained her, and she drew on genuine exhaustion to lend weight to her sorrow. "I didn't see anything. I was speaking with the king. My grandmother offered a toast. He drank, and..." Her words trailed off into silence. Loras pounded a fist against the table. "Damn it all. This is exactly what we feared at his wedding, that some coward would strike from the shadows. We only thought it would happen in King's Landing, not here." Jaime's jaw flexed. He was thinking of Cersei, no doubt, of how she would react. At last, he said, "We can't resurrect him, but we can ensure the truth is known. Our priority is to keep the peace between our houses. If I must ride to Highgarden, I will. I'll meet Lord Mace Tyrell and see that no rash action is taken." Olenna tapped her finger lightly on the table. "Our house will want to show the realm that we're cooperating fully. That is best done by sending an envoy, several envoys, to King's Landing, so Tywin sees we are not hiding from this calamity." She glanced at Marjorie. "Child, as the widow of the king, you have a unique position. But you may also be in danger if the Lannisters suspect you of wrongdoing." Marjorie swallowed, picturing Cersei's face twisted in hatred. She forced a nod. "I'll go to King's Landing if that is what must be done. I will kneel before the Queen Regent herself if necessary, to show that I had no hand in this." Jaime's gaze softened slightly with what might have been pity. "My sister will want to see you, yes. She'll want to see all of us. But I fear she will not be moved by tears or pleas of innocence." Loras leaned forward. "Then we must present undeniable proof that the Tyrells had no cause to do this. Grandmother, we came to King's Landing once before to ally with them, to feed the city, to help them. Why would we murder the king now?" He was speaking as though rational arguments might hold weight, but all in the room understood that grief-stricken vengeance seldom heeded reason. Olenna clasped her hands in her lap. "We will do what we must. I will have my stewards begin gathering statements from our staff. No one will be allowed to leave the estate until we have some measure of clarity. Then we dispatch riders to King's Landing to request that the hand of the king send someone to oversee an investigation here, lest we be accused of covering it up ourselves. We have nothing to hide." Her words were calm, firm. Then she turned to Jaime. "Is that acceptable to you, sir?" He inclined his head. "It will have to be. Better for Tywin to see we're taking every measure than for him to believe we're obstructing justice." Jaime hesitated. "We should also consider how to move the king's body. He must be laid to rest in the great September of Baelor." A shiver ran through Marjorie. She realized that in all their planning, she had never paused to consider the process of burial. Would she have to ride alongside Joffrey's corpse all the way back to King's Landing? The notion brought a wave of nausea. She pictured the silent funeral barge drifting through the city's gates, the tolling of bells summoning the people to mourn. But mourn whom? Many would quietly rejoice, believing a tyrant had finally met justice. She pressed her lips together. "I'll accompany him, of course," she said softly. "As his queen, I must do so." Jaime nodded once, seemingly convinced of her sincerity. "Very well. I'll make preparations. The gods only know how my father will respond when the news arrives." They parted with the agreement that no one would take rash steps or levy accusations without proof. In the following days, the Tyrell estate was locked down, visitors were scrutinized, and anyone who sought to depart was questioned. Margaery kept up appearances of grief, draping herself in dark gowns and receiving well-wishers who offered condolences. Olenna oversaw the quiet disposal of any potential evidence that might link them to the murder. A few snips of leftover poison, a scrap of parchment with coded references, these vanished into fireplaces or were buried in gardens when no one was looking. She did it all swiftly, with the assistance of trusted confidants. Despite the tension, no immediate spark of war ignited. The Tyrell forces did not muster for battle, and the Lannister men who remained at the estate had no standing orders from the capital to begin hostilities. A veneer of polite cooperation settled over them, each side mindful that any outbreak of violence would taint them with guilt. Meanwhile, ravens soared between King's Landing and Highgarden. They also carried messages to the Crownlands, to Casterly Rock, to the Iron Bank in Bravos, where Tywin had only just begun negotiating new terms, and to numerous lords throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The realm braced itself for the shock. King Joffrey was dead, for certain this time. In King's Landing, the bells of the Great September rang out in a solemn drone when the first raven arrived with word of the king's demise. At the Red Keep, the courtyard erupted in pandemonium as servants rushed about in fear of Cersei's wrath. Inside the royal apartments, Cersei received the news from Pycelle and a trembling messenger. The Queen Regent's shriek was said to echo through the halls, and she reportedly clawed at the messenger's face, demanding that he repeat the details of Joffrey's final moments over and over. The messenger could offer only the bare facts. The king had been feasting at a Tyrell estate. He choked on his wine. It was likely poison. Beyond that, the letter from Jaime and Olenna offered only condolences and assurances that a full investigation was underway. Cersei's grief and rage knew no bounds. She seized the letter and tore it to pieces in front of Pycelle. "Margaery, that rose-tinted harpy did this. She's wanted him dead from the start. Or that old crone, Olenna. They plotted it. I know they did," she screamed. Pycelle tried to calm her, only to be backhanded across the mouth. The old Grand Maester stumbled, too frightened to do more than babble apologies. Soon after, Cersei demanded an audience with her father, Tywin Lannister, who was already convening the small council to address the crisis. The council chamber was a storm of speculation. Varys perched by the window with his hands folded, eyes inscrutable. Qyburn, who had been creeping through the corridors of the Red Keep after Pycelle's fall from grace, stood at the periphery waiting for an opportunity. Ser Adam Marbrand and others from the City Watch were assembled, anxious for orders. Tywin, seat at the head of the table, wore an expression carved from stone. He did not weep for Joffrey, but his voice was grim as he addressed the assembled lords. "The king is dead," he said, each word measured. "He was the future of House Lannister, and now we face the question of succession and retribution." Cersei stormed into the council chamber, still clad in her nightgown, hair in disarray, face blotched with tears. "Father, we must send an army into the Reach this instant. The Tyrells cannot be allowed to get away with this." Tywin's brows knit in mild displeasure at her entrance. "We have yet to confirm the Tyrells' guilt, Cersei. Your brother Jaime's letter states that Lady Olenna is cooperating fully with an investigation, and that Margaery offered no protest. For now, they remain our allies in principle." Cersei slammed a hand against the table, rattling an inkpot. "Allies? They've murdered my son. For the sake of the Seven, how can you be so blind? First they tried at his wedding, now they've succeeded on their own lands, far from your sight. This is an act of war." Tywin inhaled slowly, controlling his temper. "I share your rage, Cersei, but I cannot share your haste. If we move an army into the Reach without proof, we risk turning every lord of the Reach against us. We are already in precarious financial straits. The Iron Bank is watching our every step. Stannis remains a threat, and so do the Ironborn. We must proceed with caution." The realm cannot afford another war without better cause. Cersei's lips curled in a snarl. We have a cause. My son was murdered. Will you wait until Tommen is murdered too? Tywin's expression remained stern. Tommen is now next in line for the throne, by all rights, unless you propose Myrcella as heir, which we cannot do while Tommen lives. We will crown Tommen king as soon as possible. That must be our first priority. He paused. After that, if we find evidence that the Tyrells orchestrated Joffrey's murder, we will act. Cersei shook her head, tears glimmering in her eyes. You are gambling with the safety of your only remaining heirs. We should put Marjorie's head on a spike. I want her seized, brought here in chains. All of them, including that old hag Olenna. Varys cleared his throat delicately. If I may, your grace, there are many rumors swirling about other enemies of the crown. The Ironborn have sacked villages near Fair Isle. House Martell still harbors ill will over Prince Oberyn's fate. Indeed, they claim we owe them justice. Even the remains of Stark loyalists in the north might see reason to strike at the crown. Poison, after all, is the weapon of subtlety. He spread his hands. It may be more prudent to gather evidence before taking irreversible steps. Cersei glared daggers at him. We have evidence. Joffrey died on Tyrell land. He was fine until that moment. Who else could have orchestrated such a thing under their very noses? Varys inclined his head. Tragic as it is, we cannot rule out other infiltrators, or the possibility that an ally of Peter Baelish had a hand. He has ties to the Vale, after all, and a proclivity for cunning plots. One hears he once had an interest in Sansa Stark, who might yet blame the Lannisters for her family's downfall. There are threads leading in many directions, my queen. Tywin listened in silence, tapping a single finger on the table. At last he rose. Enough. Cersei, you will compose yourself and receive the body of your son when it arrives. We will hold a royal funeral in the great September of Baelor. We will anoint Tommen as the next king. In the meantime, I will dispatch a party of investigators, men loyal to House Lannister, who will ride to the Tyrell estate and conduct a thorough inquiry. I will also write to Lord Mace Tyrell, demanding his immediate presence in King's Landing. If House Tyrell is innocent, they will have nothing to fear from a fair investigation. But if they are guilty? Cersei pressed, tears still wet on her cheeks. Tywin's eyes hardened. Then they will learn what it means to betray House Lannister. He inclined his head to the gathering, signaling an end to the council. Cersei lingered, glaring at Varys, Pycelle, and all assembled as though they were traitors themselves. Thus began a tense lull in King's Landing. The funeral had to be prepared, the line of succession clarified, and the city kept calm, for the small folk would not react kindly to news that another king had died. Merchants whispered that this might be the return of the curse that seemed to haunt the Iron Throne. First Robert Baratheon, then the War of the Five Kings, then Robb Stark's death in the Riverlands, and now Joffrey. Some said the gods were punishing House Lannister for its sins. Others saw it as the inevitable result of a young tyrant's cruelty. Yet outwardly, the city braced for a spectacle. The king's body would soon arrive by litter or carriage, accompanied by the weeping widow and solemn Lannister guards. Cersei was in no mood to wait patiently, though she had little choice. She ranted at anyone who dared approach her, accusing them of siding with the Tyrells. She locked herself in her chambers for hours at a time, only emerging to demand updates or to harangue her servants. Rumor claimed she smashed furniture, tore curtains, and took a lash to several maids who had been too slow in bringing her wine. The only one who might have reined her in was Jaime, but he was still out in the Reach, presumably standing watch over Joffrey's body. At the Tyrell estate, the awkward standoff persisted. Olenna Tyrell and Jaime Lannister maintained a veneer of polite collaboration, each side assisting with the investigation. Tyrell stewards meticulously recorded the comings and goings of every visitor who had been near the feast. Jaime personally questioned the kitchen staff, the stable hands, and any guards who patrolled the corridors. In a matter of days, they had a list of over 50 individuals who might have had access to Joffrey's food or drink. But no immediate suspect emerged with clear motive or means. Marjorie attended these proceedings sporadically, outwardly too grief-stricken to follow every detail. In truth, she knew her presence only stirred suspicion or pity, so it was wiser to remain half-withdrawn. Whenever she did appear, she offered calm, subdued remarks, always affirming how kindly the king had been treated, how no one in the household had cause to harm him. Loras Tyrell, who believed wholeheartedly that his family was innocent, showed real determination in finding the culprit. He flung all his energies into scouring possible leads, though they led him nowhere. The days bled into nights. Joffrey's body was prepared for transport, placed within a grand wooden coffin lined with gold filigree and the red velvet of House Lannister. Despite the summer heat, the maester did what he could to preserve the remains. A hush fell over the estate whenever the coffin was carried through the courtyard. Guests and servants alike bowed their heads, mindful that this was not just any lord or knight, but a king who had died within these walls. Even if many whispered that he had been a cruel king, the weight of ceremony remained. At last, word arrived that a party from King's Landing was en route. Leading it was Ser Kevan Lannister, Tywin's dependable brother, along with a cadre of crown officials, a few gold cloaks, and a sprinkling of knights. Tywin was too embroiled in the capital's politics to leave at once, but he had entrusted Kevan with instructions to oversee the immediate inquiry on Lannister behalf. By then, the investigators from the Tyrell side had gleaned nothing definitive, so Olenna and Jaime both hoped Kevan might bring some clarity. Kevan arrived late in the afternoon, his entourage stirring dust on the estate's gravel path. Olenna and Jaime met him in the courtyard, flanked by rows of servants and soldiers. Kevan was a stout, serious man, with graying hair and a calm demeanor. He wore the Lannister lion on his surcoat, and he rode with the upright posture of a commander long accustomed to discipline. As soon as he dismounted, Jaime clasped his uncle's hand in greeting, murmuring, "Any word from King's Landing?" Kevan nodded curtly, though he cast a keen glance at Olenna. "My brother expects a thorough account. He's prepared to coordinate a formal inquest at the Red Keep upon the arrival of the body. The funeral is to follow. The Queen Regent is inconsolable. She demands justice." Olenna dipped her head. "We want no less, Ser Kevan. You are welcome to question anyone in this household." That seemed to please Kevan, at least in the sense that the Tyrells were not hindering him. "I will, my lady," he said, adjusting his gloves. "But first, show me the king's coffin and the chamber where the deed occurred. I have men skilled in investigating such matters." Jaime led him inside, while Olenna excused herself to arrange accommodations for the visitors. Marjorie, who had been alerted to Kevan's arrival, waited in a nearby corridor. She emerged to greet him with a trembling curtsy. Dressed in a black gown trimmed with gold, she looked every inch the mourning queen. "Ser Kevan," she said in a voice carefully modulated with sorrow and respect, "thank you for coming. I pray you'll help us find whoever did this." Kevan's gaze was not unkind, but neither did he spare her from scrutiny. "My lady, I share your grief. I promise the crown will do all it can." He studied her face, as if searching for cracks in her facade. But Marjorie merely bowed her head, and Kevan continued onward. It took another 4 days of interviews, cross-examinations, and discreet rummaging through storerooms and servants' quarters before Kevan finally declared that there was no immediate proof of Tyrell involvement. He confessed to Jaime, in confidence, that a cunning assassin could have easily slipped poison into Joffrey's cup with minimal traces left behind. "Whoever did this," Kevan said, "chose a time and place guaranteed to cast suspicion on the Tyrells, but not enough to convict them outright. My brother will not be pleased." Jaime raked a hand through his hair, exhaustion etched into his features. "I understand. We must deliver the body to King's Landing. Then, let the formal inquest begin under Tywin's authority." Kevan regarded his nephew closely. "You believe Marjorie innocent?" Jaime hesitated. In his heart, he remembered Joffrey's bruises on the day he'd struck Marjorie, remembered the swirl of rumors about how Marjorie was the only one who could keep Joffrey calm. If anyone had motive, it might have been her. But at the same time, she had seemed genuinely terrified of Joffrey's rages and eager to avoid them. She might have sought freedom from that cruelty, or the Tyrells might have chosen to protect their prized daughter. Jaime disliked dwelling on it. "I can't say with certainty," he finally answered, voice tight. "But we have no proof. She's played the part of the grieving widow convincingly, and I know what real fear looks like. She had it in her eyes often enough." Kevin nodded. "Indeed, we must let the matter proceed in the capital. Meanwhile, the funeral cannot be delayed any longer. Gather your guards. We ride for King's Landing at dawn." Morning sunlight gilded the estate's courtyard as the coffin containing King Joffrey's remains was lifted into a sturdy wagon draped with crimson and gold cloth. A procession of Tyrell knights accompanied, their banners drooping in the still air. House Lannister's men, led by Jaime and Kevin, formed the honor guard. Marjorie rode in a carriage behind the wagon, her face concealed by a dark veil. Olenna bid them farewell at the gate, claiming that her old bones could not endure the journey so soon after the shock. She promised to follow later, once matters at the estate were settled. Loras Tyrell, still determined to see justice done, insisted on going with the funeral train, riding near his sister's carriage to protect her honor. Despite outward courtesy, tensions ran high. The hush of the traveling column was broken only by the clank of armor and the rumble of wheels on the road. Guards rode with hands on sword hilts, as though expecting a sudden betrayal. Each time they stopped at an inn or a crossroads, the local folk would kneel or press themselves to the roadside, gawking at the wagon that bore the dead king. Rumors preceded them. By the time they reached the Rose Road, travelers were already whispering of a second poisoning, of vile conspiracies in the heart of the Reach. Some even invented wild tales, that a vengeful ghost had strangled Joffrey, or that a dire wolf had cursed him from the north. The truth, as always, was shrouded beneath a tapestry of speculation. Marjorie spent most of the journey in silence, gazing out the carriage window at the passing fields and farms. She recalled her early days of marriage to Joffrey, how she had believed she might quell his cruelty through careful flattery, how she had sought to weave illusions of generosity around him. For a time, she thought she could steer him, mitigate the worst of his nature. But eventually, she had seen that small corrections would not suffice. Now he was gone, and she prayed the realm might breathe easier. Yet the shadow of her own guilt loomed large. She had all but sealed the contract with Olenna to take his life. There was no turning back, no forgetting. A part of her wondered if, despite Joffrey's monstrous streak, she might one day regret orchestrating his death. What if the realm fell into greater disarray? What if Tommen proved as malleable as a doll in Cersei's hands, and the war resumed? Marjorie pressed her lips together, trying to calm the swirl of doubts. She reminded herself that countless lives had been spared from Joffrey's sadism, that the alliances of the realm stood a better chance without him. She had done what she must, but she knew that the lioness in King's Landing would not rest until she tasted blood in return. They reached the outskirts of King's Landing in just over a week. The summer heat pressed down, thick and cloying, making the city reek of sewage and sweat. The funeral train inched through the thronged streets, preceded by gold cloaks who shouted for the crowds to clear a path. Commoners strained for a glimpse of the coffin. Some jeered, ever so quietly, while others wore expressions of fear or awe. In the distance, the walls of the Red Keep rose ominously, with the great September of Baelor's 7 towers glimmering in the haze. The slow climb up to the Red Keep felt interminable. Once inside the gates, Kevin took immediate command, ordering the coffin to be placed in a guarded courtyard until the formal rites were ready. Jaime dismounted near Marjorie's carriage, opening the door for her. She stepped out with calculated poise, ignoring the sweat that trickled beneath her black veil. Loras, standing by with a protective posture, gave her a slight nod. She must face this moment with all the regal composure she could muster. Cersei stood on the steps leading into the keep, flanked by a squad of Lannister guards. Her face was gaunt, eyes shadowed with sleepless fury. As Marjorie approached, accompanied by Jaime and Kevin, Cersei's expression contorted into something akin to disgust. The Queen Regent said nothing at first, letting silence wrap them. Then, in a voice trembling with rage, she spoke. "How dare you return to this city?" she hissed at Marjorie. "Bringing my son's corpse in your wake, after you lured him to the Reach to die like a rat." Loras bristled. "Your Grace, mind your words. My sister." Cersei's hand lashed out, catching Loras across the face in a stinging blow. "Silence!" she screamed. Her eyes blazed as she pointed at Marjorie. "I know you murdered him. All your honeyed words, your false charities, merely the cloak for your treachery. The moment you had him away from me, you struck." Jaime tried to intervene, stepping between them. "Cersei, this is not the time or place. Father wants the inquest to proceed calmly. Marjorie came here willingly. Willingly to gloat, no doubt." Cersei snarled, tears glinting in her eyes. She was always ambitious, always playing the sweet queen, telling Joffrey to show mercy, to share bread with beggars. Perhaps she found him too difficult to control, so she got rid of him. Marjorie, stung by the raw loathing in Cersei's voice, managed a tremulous whisper. "I loved him, Your Grace. I did nothing." "Lies!" Cersei shrieked, lunging forward. Jaime had to catch her by the arm to keep her from clawing Marjorie's face. The courtyard was alive with tension. Guards shifted, uncertain whether to restrain the Queen Regent. Loras glared, hand on the pommel of his sword, but Kevin stepped in quickly. "Sister," Kevin said firmly, "you do House Lannister no favors by attacking our guests before the inquest. This matter will be settled under Lord Tywin's authority. You must remember we have no proof yet." Cersei shook off Jaime's grip, breathing hard, tears streaming down her cheeks. She stared at Marjorie for a long moment, brimming with silent loathing, then whirled and stalked into the Red Keep, her heavy skirts swishing against the stones. The assembled crowd in the courtyard gradually began to disperse under Kevin's orders, and Jaime gave Marjorie a look that held both apology and warning. "You see how she is," he said. "For your own sake, stay close to Loras or to me or my uncle. Do not seek her out." Marjorie exhaled, trembling. "I have no wish to confront her." Inwardly, she marveled at the raw hatred Cersei displayed. This was not a cunning foe so much as a wounded, cornered lioness, lashing out in blind fury. That might be even more dangerous. Within hours, Tywin Lannister summoned Marjorie, Jaime, Kevin, and Loras to the Tower of the Hand. The upper floor's solar offered a sweeping view of Blackwater Bay. Tywin sat behind a massive oaken desk, his posture rigid. Hands steepled, he let them stand before him, a show of authority. Though well past his prime, Tywin exuded the contained intensity of a man who had led armies and controlled kings. Behind him, half-drawn curtains glowed with the late afternoon sun. "You have returned with my grandson's body," he said, voice low and cold. "I commend you, Ser Jaime, Ser Kevin, for not allowing rash violence to break out. But that is where my commendations end." He turned his piercing gaze upon Marjorie. "My grandson died in your family's home, under your watch. Why?" Marjorie could feel the tension coil in her gut. She bowed her head. "My lord, I wish I had an answer. We have found no culprit, no direct evidence. I swear to you I had no part in harming him. It was my family's intention only to show him hospitality. We wanted—" Tywin cut her off with a wave. "Save your pleas for the inquest. Whether you wanted it or not, the king is dead, and now the realm is in an uproar. My daughter demands your head. Others whisper that the Martells or Baelish or the Ironborn might be responsible. The truth is that we do not know. That is intolerable." Ser Loras stepped forward, chin held high. "Lord Tywin, House Tyrell had nothing to gain from Joffrey's death. Our alliance was sealed by marriage. We remain loyal to the crown. We will do whatever you ask to prove it." Tywin's cold eyes flicked to Loras. "Will you?" he asked softly. "I recall you once supported Renly Baratheon's claim, and your father, Mace Tyrell, has always been one to follow the winds of power. Are you so certain you had nothing to gain by removing a tyrannical young king who scorned your counsel? Loras flushed. He was the rightful king by your own decree. We accepted him. My sister put her life in his hands when she married him. We do not break guest right in our own hall. A thin smile crossed Tywin's lips. We shall see. The inquest will take place in the throne room tomorrow morning, presided over by myself, the Queen Regent, and any members of the small council who wish to attend. In truth, it will serve more as a preliminary hearing. If any immediate suspect arises, they will be put to question. Is that understood? Marjorie murmured. Yes, my lord. Jaime, who stood to the side with arms folded, shifted. Father, I'd advise caution. Cersei. Tywin's attention snapped to him. I have matters well in hand, Jaime. You need not instruct me on how to handle my daughter. He exhaled, regaining composure. For now, keep the peace. If the Tyrells are indeed guilty, we will know soon enough. If not, I will not see the realm rent asunder by a mother's blind fury. Joffrey was my grandson, but I have another to think of now. Tommen. The crown must endure. He gestured for them to leave. Jaime lingered half a heartbeat, as if he wanted to say more, but Tywin had already returned his gaze to the pile of documents on the desk, dismissing them. Marjorie and Loras exchanged glances, both equally uneasy about what the next day would bring. That night, Marjorie stayed in a small set of rooms near Maegor's Holdfast, graciously provided by the Queen Regent. She suspected they were more akin to a gilded cell than actual hospitality, for the door guards were Lannister men, not Tyrell. Loras was given a guest room down the same corridor. The tension was suffocating. At dinner, none of the royal family joined her. She ate alone, picking at a cold plate of bread and stew before setting it aside. Sleep was elusive. She spent much of the night pacing, imagining every possible scenario in the upcoming hearing. Would Cersei's accusations hold any sway without proof? Could Marjorie or the Tyrells shift the blame onto some nameless assassin? Or would Tyrion be roped into accusations yet again, as he had been at the Purple Wedding? When morning came, she dressed in a simple black gown that covered her arms and throat, and she carefully braided her hair beneath a modest veil. She wanted to appear as the grieving widow, not the coquettish Rose. Loras arrived to escort her to the throne room, wearing the white and gold surcoat that signaled his membership in the Kingsguard, though it was battered with travel dust and overshadowed by the tension in his eyes. Together, they traversed the corridors, passing grand columns, walls lined with tapestries, and the occasional cluster of watchers who paused to stare. The throne room was guarded by gold cloaks and Lannister men-at-arms. Inside, a small crowd had already gathered, highborn courtiers, members of the small council, and an assortment of lesser lords and ladies. Varys stood near a pillar, arms folded within his voluminous robes. Qyburn hovered near the dais, wearing the dark clothing of an unorthodox maester. Pycelle, looking frail, sat in a chair fanning himself. Ser Meryn Trant and Ser Boros Blunt of the Kingsguard stood on either side of the Iron Throne, which loomed above them like a spiked specter. Seated on the Iron Throne itself, stiff-backed, was Cersei Lannister, clad in a morning gown of black satin, her golden hair braided with a net of onyx beads. Her face bore lines of grief, but her posture was that of a queen determined to exact vengeance. At the foot of the dais, Tywin stood, robed in the red and gold of House Lannister, his gaze like cold steel. Tommen was absent. The boy had apparently been shielded from the day's events. This was Tywin's show. Marjorie and Loras approached, bowed low. Tywin gestured, and a herald announced, "Let all bear witness. This preliminary inquest into the death of his late grace, King Joffrey Baratheon, will now commence. The hand of the king, Lord Tywin Lannister, presides in the Queen Regent's presence." Tywin's voice carried, "Bring forth anyone who bears testimony regarding the king's demise." One by one, the knights and attendants who had traveled with Joffrey's funeral train stepped forward to describe what they had seen in the Tyrell Estates Hall. The accounts were mostly identical. The feast proceeded without incident, Then a toast was made, and soon after, the king fell choking. No one admitted seeing a suspicious hand slip poison into Joffrey's cup. A few servants testified via second-hand rumor that someone in the kitchens might have meddled with the wine casks, but no cask was found to be tainted. Kevin Lannister gave a succinct summary of his investigation, concluding that while poison was certain, the culprit remained unknown. Cersei watched all of this with undisguised impatience. At last, she spoke, her voice echoing in the hall. "Where is the so-called Queen Dowager? Bring her forward, so we may hear her excuse." A herald cleared his throat. "The Queen Widow, Margaery Tyrell, stands ready to speak." At Tywin's nod, Margaery stepped forward alone, Loras remaining behind with the line of witnesses. She forced herself to remain poised, though her stomach twisted with tension. Cersei stared down at her from the Iron Throne, eyes gleaming with malice. "Tell us, Margaery Tyrell, how you enticed my son to the Reach, how you filled his mind with your manipulations, and how, ultimately, you poisoned him." Tywin, frowning, interjected, "Cersei, we agreed to allow her to speak before casting accusations." Cersei ignored him. "Well, what have you to say?" She clenched the arms of the throne, knuckles white. Margaery dipped her head, letting sorrow lace her voice. "I invited His Grace to visit my family's estate for a short respite from the city, yes. It was meant to be a gesture of unity, to show him the bounties of the Reach and further strengthen our alliance. My father, Lord Mace Tyrell, was expected to join us, but matters at Highgarden delayed him. We never intended harm. I loved King Joffrey, as I have said many times. I devoted myself to him from the day we were wed." Cersei barked a bitter laugh. "Love? He told me you tried to curb his every pleasure, that you prevented him from punishing those who disobeyed, that you meddled in his affairs. Is that love or manipulation?" Margaery forced tears to glisten in her eyes. "I cared for him enough to try to guide him, yes. I believed that by showing mercy and generosity, he would earn the love of the realm more deeply than by fear alone. If that was wrong, I beg your forgiveness, but it was no act of murder. I only wanted him to be a king the people could adore as much as I did." Cersei's lip curled. "Pretty words. So you insist you had no part in his death? Then who, pray tell, do you accuse? Or is it merely coincidence that my son dies on Tyrell land?" Margaery's voice softened further, feigning near helplessness. "I do not know who did this foul deed. I wish I did. All I can say is that the Tyrell estate and everyone in it cooperated fully with the investigation led by Ser Jaime and Ser Kevin. We found no culprit, no single thread leading to any of our people. It could have been an outsider, someone who bribed a servant or slipped in unnoticed. The war left many cunning assassins roaming the land." Cersei was about to retort, but Tywin raised a commanding hand. "Enough. We have heard from the Queen Widow. The official inquiry must weigh her testimony along with all other evidence. Unless you can produce direct proof, Cersei, we will not condemn her out of hand." That hammered a bitter scowl onto the Queen Regent's face. She leaned back on the throne, forced to bite her tongue. Tywin's expression was impassive, betraying nothing, though Margaery saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes. He was not easily swayed by tears or fury. He wanted rational certainty, a scapegoat with evidence. Without that, he would not risk plunging the kingdom into another war, at least not yet. Varys took a half-step forward, bowing lightly. "If I may, my Lord Hand, I suggest that in the absence of a clear culprit, we might look more closely at known enemies of the crown. The Ironborn under Balon Greyjoy still harass the western coasts. House Martell in Dorne has sworn vengeance for the death of Prince Oberyn. Stannis Baratheon remains at Dragonstone, claiming the throne is his. Any of these parties might have reason to see King Joffrey fall. And, of course, Littlefinger's whereabouts are never fully accounted for." Cersei's laugh was scornful. "So you name half the realm, Spider. How does that help us find the murderer?" Varys spread his hands in an apologetic gesture. "I offer possibilities, my queen. One cannot discount the chance that House Tyrell was used as the unwitting stage for a cunning plot." Tywin's frown deepened. We will continue the investigation, but we cannot linger in fruitless speculation forever. This is only the preliminary hearing. Further proceedings will be undertaken if more evidence arises. In the meantime, the realm needs a king. Tommen will be crowned within the fortnight. The watchers in the throne room murmured at the finality of that announcement. Tommen's coronation would be a grand affair, and typically the presence of the king's widow, now the Dowager Queen, would be expected. Margaery wondered whether Cersei would dare try to keep her away. Tywin concluded, "Until such time as the inquiry produces a suspect, no official charges will be laid at House Tyrell's feet. However, the alliance between our houses must be reevaluated. The terms of your marriage contract were predicated on Joffrey's union with Margaery. Now that he is gone, we must discuss how best to preserve the peace." Loras stiffened visibly. The memory of how swiftly Margaery had been married off first to Renly, then to Joffrey, no doubt weighed on him. Was Tywin hinting that Margaery might be married again? To Tommen? The notion sent a cold flutter through Margaery's stomach. Tommen was a mere child. A kind boy from what she had seen, but a child nonetheless. Cersei seemed to guess Tywin's intentions as well. Her face darkened, but she did not speak. She had no wish to see Margaery in power once again, wrapped around another of Cersei's sons. Yet she also knew Tywin would do whatever was necessary for House Lannister's advantage. Satisfied he had made his point, Tywin struck the floor with his staff. "This hearing is adjourned. The funeral for King Joffrey will take place in the Great September in 2 days' time. May the Seven judge his soul." He said the last phrase without emotion, then gestured for the guards to clear the room. An uneasy stirring went through the assembled courtiers. Margaery offered a final bow, then retreated with Loras. Before she could leave the throne room entirely, a voice at her elbow made her turn. It was Varys, wearing a grave expression. "My condolences, dear lady," he whispered. "Such a sorrow to lose 2 husbands in so short a span." Margaery managed a wan smile. "My thanks, Lord Varys. May it be the last sorrow I face for a long while." Varys's dark eyes glinted with sympathetic cunning. "From your lips to the gods' ears." Then he melted away, leaving Margaery and Loras to cross the echoing hall. In the corridor, Loras muttered a curse under his breath. "They'll try to marry you to Tommen. Father will probably jump at the chance. Another tie to the throne, and the boy can be shaped more easily than Joffrey." Margaery set a hand on her brother's arm. "Let us not jump to conclusions. Lord Tywin might consider it, but Cersei will fight tooth and nail." They walked in silence for a moment, passing under the tall windows that let in shafts of morning light. The walls seemed to close in around them, a labyrinth of intrigue. Margaery considered the horrifying possibility that Tywin would push for a quick wedding to Tommen. A child king and a twice-widowed queen. How would that appear to the realm? Rumors would swirl. Cersei would be inconsolable, and Margaery herself felt exhaustion at the notion. She had done all of this to free the realm from Joffrey, not to entangle herself with an even younger boy who might be used as a puppet by her own family or by the Lannisters. But the realm needed stability. Tywin would not relent in that purpose. And as much as Cersei's rage threatened to tear the alliance apart, Mace Tyrell might well see it as an opportunity. Margaery's mind whirled with the next round of maneuvers. She suppressed the urge to weep for the simpler days when she was a girl in Highgarden, believing knights were gallant and kings were noble. That naive child was gone, replaced by a woman who had conspired to kill a king and might soon be forced to marry another. The day of the funeral dawned, sullen and overcast. The Great September of Baelor loomed on Visegrad's hill, its steps draped in black hangings. A line of mourners, from highborn lords to curious small folk, filed in under the watchful eyes of the faith militant and the city watch. Though the War of the Five Kings had decimated many houses, the nobility still turned out in force to witness the funeral of another Baratheon Lannister king, a scene all too reminiscent of the funerals that had followed Robert Baratheon's death. The city's mood was taut, like a bowstring drawn to snapping. Within the sept, tall marble pillars soared toward the dome, where colored glass filtered the dim light. 7 towering statues of the gods ringed the central altar. At the foot of the altar lay Joffrey's body, on display in regal funeral attire. His face had been made up to mask the signs of poison, but the lifeless pallor and slight swelling around his throat were still visible. Candles flickered on either side, and incense filled the air with a cloying sweetness that fought the underlying stench of death. Cersei, draped in black veils, stood at the side of the bier, one hand resting on her son's chest. Tommen stood just behind her, eyes wide with the stunned sorrow of a boy who barely understood the finality of death. Myrcella was in Dorne, out of reach. Jaime was there in a place of honor, though his Kingsguard cloak was draped over his truncated right arm, reminding all who glanced at him of the war's lasting scars. Kevan and Tywin stood near the center aisle, stoic and unspeaking. The entire royal family was arrayed in mourning, forming a tableau of silent grief. When Margaery arrived, escorted by her brother, every eye seemed to turn upon her. She moved carefully, wearing a sable cloak over a simple gown, her face partly hidden by a sheer black veil. The hush that followed her felt oppressive. Cersei lifted her head, staring with unbridled hatred. She did not speak, nor did she move from her vigil. Tywin beckoned Margaery to stand on the opposite side of the bier, a space that had clearly been designated for the king's widow. As Margaery approached, the sweet incense caught at the back of her throat, making her want to cough. She steeled herself, looking down at Joffrey's face. Once, not so long ago, she had tried to charm him, had placed her hand in his and smiled for the crowds, had let him believe she adored him. Now he lay still and cold, his golden hair combed neatly, a crown of rubies on his brow. If not for the memory of his cruelty, she might have wept in earnest. But her tears were laced with guilt and relief. She bowed her head, feigning the trembling sorrow that a widow should display. A septon began the formal rites, reciting prayers to the father and the mother to judge and guide King Joffrey's soul. His voice echoed in the cavernous space, occasionally punctuated by the sniffling of nobles who put on a show of mourning. Outside, bells tolled in a slow, methodical cadence. Loras stood behind Margaery, face grim. Tyrion Lannister was absent from the dais. He had stood at the back of the sept, apparently not wishing to draw attention, though a few curious eyes sought him out. He and Joffrey had never been close. Rumors still circulated that Tyrion had a hand in the earlier near-poisoning, but no one approached him now. As the septon droned on, Margaery felt Cersei's gaze, hot and hateful, burning into her. She did not lift her own eyes to meet it. Instead, she focused on the flicker of candles, the swirl of incense, the cold visage of the dead king. Time seemed to stretch. At last, the septon signaled the recessional. A group of faith attendants came forward, lifting the coffin in preparation for its final entombment within the cathedral's crypt. The watchers parted, forming a corridor for the bier to pass. Cersei pressed a lingering kiss to Joffrey's forehead before letting the attendants bear him away. Margaery stepped aside, head bowed, feeling the weight of the city's scrutiny. Then, as the procession began to move, Cersei pivoted and seized Margaery's arm in a punishing grip. The widow almost gasped at the force of it. A hush fell over those nearest them. Cersei's voice was low, quivering with raw emotion. "You may have fooled my father, my brothers, the entire realm," she hissed. "But I know what you are." She tightened her grasp painfully. "If you think I'll ever let you near Tommen, you're a bigger fool than I thought. You won't steal another son from me." Margaery looked at Cersei's pale, contorted face, saw the anguish behind the rage, and wondered if she was about to be struck again. But at that moment, Jaime stepped forward, gently prying Cersei's fingers from Margaery's arm. He spoke in a low tone. "Cersei, not now. This is a funeral." Cersei seemed on the verge of shrieking, but the presence of so many lords and ladies, combined with Tywin's stony stare from across the sept, restrained her. She let go, trembling, and glared at Margaery with blazing eyes. Then she stormed after the departing bier, leaving Margaery to nurse the bruises on her arm. Jaime offered Marjorie a tight frown. "I told you, stay close to guards who won't yield to her. She's not stable right now." Marjorie's throat felt dry. "I understand," she managed. Then she let Loras lead her away, grateful for the chance to catch her breath. In the days following the funeral, the city seemed suspended in an uneasy stasis. Tommen was set to be crowned in the September soon enough, but in the interim, Tywin pressed the Tyrells to reaffirm their loyalty and keep the grain shipments flowing to King's Landing. Mace Tyrell arrived from Highgarden, blustering with outward sorrow over the king's death, though he seemed more interested in the details of the possible betrothal between Tommen and Marjorie. Whenever Mace was in private with Marjorie, he extolled the virtues of forging a new union, reminding her that it was vital to the realm and House Tyrell's ongoing influence. She felt a chill each time the subject was raised, remembering the wide-eyed boy who clutched at his cat and seemed scarcely old enough to read. In the Red Keep, Cersei fumed. She would not countenance the idea of Marjorie remarrying into her family, but Tywin had grown weary of her protests. After one particularly vicious argument, Tywin declared that, for the sake of the realm, Tommen would marry Marjorie at the soonest appropriate time. The crown required Tyrell gold and provisions. The boy needed a queen if his rule was to seem legitimate. Marjorie was the perfect symbol of continuity, her presence soothing the small folk who had grown used to her charitable displays alongside Joffrey. Cersei raged, but Tywin overruled her. Tommen himself, though frightened of his mother, seemed too timid to voice any objection. And so, in a matter of weeks, shockingly soon after Joffrey's funeral, the city began preparing for another royal wedding. The cynics muttered that the Tyrell girl had a taste for crowns, having worn them twice already. Some jested that she was cursed, for each husband died soon after wedding her. But the official line from the crown was that Marjorie had proven her loyalty, that the crown sought to heal from its tragedy by forging a stronger alliance. The lavishness of the new wedding was scaled back, out of respect for the recent funeral, but it was a wedding nonetheless. Marjorie felt as though she were trapped in a surreal haze. She roamed the corridors of the Red Keep, recalling how she had once entered these same halls as a bride to Joffrey. Everything had changed since then. She carried the secret of Joffrey's murder, a burden that weighed on her soul. Yet outwardly, she was again being hailed as a bride, this time to a boy who barely reached her shoulder. Sometimes, Tommen would shyly ask about the duties of a king, about whether she liked cats, about what it was like growing up in Highgarden. He seemed sweet, naive, wholly unprepared. She did her best to reassure him, all the while haunted by the knowledge of what she had done to his brother. Still, the alternative, to let another monstrous Lannister seize power, or to let the realm tear itself apart in blame, seemed worse. A measure of guilt wove itself into her attempts to be kind to Tommen. If she could guide him well, help him grow into a gentle, just king, perhaps that might be some penance for her sin. Meanwhile, the matter of Joffrey's murder had not been laid to rest. Tywin ordered quiet investigations across the kingdom, searching for any sign that this had been planned by foreign agents. Varys, in his cryptic way, fed him morsels of rumor. A certain Sellsword might have visited the Tyrell estate recently. A particular alchemist rumored to brew poison was seen traveling the Rose Road. None of it amounted to firm proof. For every rumor pointing one way, another rumor pointed elsewhere. Cersei was convinced Marjorie was guilty, but she found no allies to support an arrest without evidence. As the coronation of Tommen approached, Cersei wrestled with the demands of ceremony. Tywin insisted that as Queen Regent, she should place the crown upon Tommen's head, a visual statement that the Lannisters upheld the Baratheon lineage. Marjorie would stand at Tommen's side as his betrothed, but the official wedding would take place shortly after, ensuring the Child King was crowned first. Cersei balked at the thought of Marjorie anywhere near Tommen, but Tywin's decree was ironclad. On a crisp morning, amid the tolling of bells, Tommen was anointed by the High Septon. The child trembled, reciting the words that declared him king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, protector of the realm. Cersei placed the crown on his fair head, tears slipping down her cheeks as she did so. Marjorie stood on the dais, wearing a subdued gown of pale green, offering a gentle, encouraging smile to the boy. She felt the eyes of thousands upon her. If the crowd found the spectacle strange, this recrowning so soon after Joffrey's funeral, they dared not speak it aloud. Tommen's voice squeaked as he took his vows to rule justly. The city's heralds proclaimed him King Tommen of the House Baratheon. The small folk cheered out of habit or curiosity, but their applause was tepid compared to the celebrations once seen for Joffrey's wedding. Too many had lost faith in the monarchy after so much bloodshed. Still, for a fleeting moment, Marjorie allowed herself to hope that Tommen might be a better king than his brother. If guided gently by wise counselors, and if kept from Cersei's destructive paranoia, he could grow into a kinder ruler. After the coronation, a more private ceremony formalized Tommen's betrothal to Marjorie. No feast was held, no tournament. The city was still in mourning for Joffrey, and the crown's coffers ran low. Tywin was in no mood for frivolity. The alliance needed to be sealed, not flaunted. A simple exchange of words sufficed, in the presence of a few witnesses and the High Septon. When it was done, Tommen looked at Marjorie with a mixture of childish admiration and nervousness. She smiled back, the picture of gentle reassurance. Cersei stood rigidly, silent as the grave, her eyes flicking between them, loathing plain on her face. One could almost see her thoughts. She would never allow Marjorie the influence she had gained with Joffrey. This time, the Tyrell Queen would be kept under watch. In the weeks that followed, Marjorie settled into a strange routine. She was a betrothed queen once again, but with a child groom who spent most of his day in lessons or playing with his cats. She accompanied him on short walks in the castle gardens, praising his cleverness when he identified a species of flower, or making gentle suggestions about how a king should treat his subjects. Tommen listened eagerly, as any child might listen to a trusted older friend or sibling. He had never known a mother's gentle guidance except in fleeting moments. Cersei, for all her devotion, was more prone to controlling outbursts than nurturing instruction. Marjorie tried to be patient, remembering that it might take years for Tommen to mature enough to truly rule. In the meantime, Tywin wielded actual power as the hand, shaping policy and commanding the realm's forces. The search for Joffrey's murderer continued in the background, overshadowed by other pressing matters. Stannis Baratheon still threatened from Dragonstone, though rumors claimed many of his men were deserting, unsettled by his reliance on Red Priestess magic. The Ironborn under Balon Greyjoy harassed the west. Dorne remained sullen in the south, angered by Oberyn's death. The north simmered under the Boltons, with scattered pockets of Stark loyalists rumored to cause trouble. If Joffrey's poisoner was one of these outside forces, they covered their tracks well. Tywin poured resources into intelligence and bribes, but no single culprit emerged. The tension eased somewhat, as if the realm itself was relieved to be rid of Joffrey, no matter who had done the deed. Still, Cersei refused to let the matter die. She confronted Marjorie whenever she found her alone, hurling accusations in hushed, venomous tirades. Marjorie deflected them with pleas of innocence and references to Tywin's official stance. Each time, Cersei grew more enraged. She was no longer the commanding queen regent who had reigned under Joffrey. Now she was overshadowed by Tywin's authority and threatened by Marjorie's rising influence over Tommen. Her desperation lent her a volatile edge that made her dangerous. One evening, Marjorie returned to her chambers after a short stroll with Tommen in the gardens. She found her ladies waiting with anxious faces. Lady Alice, a distant cousin of House Tyrell, curtsied and whispered, "Your Grace, we must warn you. The Queen Regent was in here earlier, rummaging through your drawers. She dismissed us and threatened punishment if we spoke of it. I fear she's looking for something to implicate you in the king's murder." Marjorie's heart lurched. She had been careful to destroy or hide any scrap of evidence pointing to her involvement. What few clues had existed were mostly back at the Tyrell estate, carefully disposed of by Olenna. Still, Cersei might fabricate evidence if she grew desperate enough. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "Keep your eyes open, and inform me if she returns." Lady Alice bowed. "Yes, Your Grace." That night, Marjorie slept fitfully, half expecting Cersei to barge in with gold cloaks to drag her away. But no one came. The next morning brought an invitation to dine with the king, Tywin, and a few members of the small council. Marjorie accepted with outward grace, though her nerves were on edge. These council dinners were often policy discussions cloaked in pleasantries. She had begun to learn the intricacies of realm governance. The trade routes, the debts to the Iron Bank, the harvest yields from the Reach and the Riverlands, the precarious alliances at court. Tywin let her speak occasionally, especially if it concerned Tyrell resources. Tommen mostly stayed quiet, glancing shyly at Marjorie as if for reassurance. As the meal proceeded, Cersei took her seat opposite Marjorie. She drank more wine than usual, face drawn. Tywin controlled the conversation, while Pycelle and Qyburn offered updates on supply lines, medical concerns, and rumors from the east of Daenerys Targaryen, though no one was certain if the Targaryen girl truly had dragons or if that was a fable. All the while, Marjorie remained attentive, offering measured input on how best to supply the crown with staples from the Reach, mindful that Tywin expected her to speak as a partner, not a subject. Toward the end of the dinner, Tommen excused himself with a child's politeness, claiming tiredness. Tywin allowed it, nodding that Pycelle's assistant should escort the boy back to his chambers. Once Tommen was gone, the room's atmosphere changed palpably. Tywin eyed Marjorie, sipped from his cup, then said, "We are close to finalizing the terms for your marriage. The ceremony must not be ostentatious, given that Joffrey's funeral is still recent. But it must have enough solemnity to legitimize the new king." Marjorie lowered her gaze. "I will do whatever is required, my lord. Tommen is precious, and I wish only to support him." Cersei let out a quiet snort, swirling the wine in her cup. Tywin ignored her. "Given the boy's age, we will not expect you to share his bed immediately. That can wait until he's older. But you will be crowned queen in the eyes of the Seven. Your father has already pledged a significant dowry to mark this union." Marjorie's stomach twisted at the thought of how her father likely patted his belly in contentment, thinking he'd secured the Tyrell's place at court once again. She forced a polite nod. "Yes, my lord." Tywin's tone cooled a fraction. "Good. The wedding will take place in a fortnight. In the meantime, keep a distance from any scandal or rumor. The realm has endured enough talk of poisonings and conspiracies. Do I make myself clear?" Marjorie swallowed. "Yes, my lord. Perfectly." Cersei pinned her with a stare. "Make sure there's no cause for fresh rumors, Marjorie. The slightest whiff of impropriety, and I will." Tywin cut her off with a sharp look. "That will be all, daughter. Let us not mar the family's reputation further." Cersei glowered but fell silent. Marjorie seized the chance to rise, curtsy, and take her leave. As she made her way down the corridor, she heard the faint, muffled sound of Cersei's voice rising behind the closed door, presumably arguing with Tywin. The swirl of intrigue never ceased. 2 weeks later, under a sky tinged with gold and pink, Tommen Baratheon and Marjorie Tyrell were wed in the Great September of Baelor. The ceremony was modest by royal standards. No massive feasts, no dwarfs performing, no riotous pageants. Instead, it was a solemn vow, presided over by the High Septon, with fewer lords in attendance than Joffrey's wedding had drawn. Yet the city still turned out to watch the procession, if only to see the Child King's new bride. Rumors that Marjorie was cursed circulated in hushed corners, while others insisted she was the realm's only hope for a kinder monarchy. Tommen recited his vows with an earnest, trembling voice, often glancing at Marjorie for reassurance. She spoke her part calmly, a model of composure. When they emerged from the September as husband and wife, Cersei stood to one side, face pale and tight, while Tywin donned a mask of restrained approval. Loras hovered protectively near Marjorie, sharing a look of relief that the ceremony had concluded without incident. The small folk offered polite cheers, scattering a few rose petals that drifted on the breeze. That night, a modest feast took place in the Red Keep's throne room, but it was overshadowed by the memory of the wedding feast that had claimed Joffrey's life. Servants were vigilant, tasting every dish. No one wanted another purple wedding. The revelry was subdued. A few musicians played gentle tunes. No jesters performed. Marjorie and Tommen sat side by side at the high table, occasionally exchanging a soft word. He was too young to drink more than watered wine, and she sipped hers sparingly. Cersei was nowhere to be seen at the feast, and Tywin explained that she was unwell. Some guessed she refused to watch her youngest son share the dais with the woman she deemed a murderess. Nonetheless, the hours passed in relative calm, and by the time the final courses were cleared away, the new king was half asleep in his chair. Marjorie politely rose and accompanied him out, aware that no bedding ceremony would take place. The entire event felt like an odd pantomime. Guards escorted them to the royal apartments, where Tommen was led to his own bedchamber by a stern-faced septa. Marjorie was shown to the adjacent queen's chambers, richly appointed but empty of warmth. She closed the door behind her, feeling a wave of profound weariness. Twice widowed, now wed to a boy king. She had done so much, sacrificed so much, and committed an unthinkable crime, all to see the realm stabilized. Would it hold? In the corridor beyond, her ladies gathered, offering congratulations and assisting with the removal of her ceremonial garments. Marjorie allowed them to unpin the elaborate braids in her hair. She stared at her reflection in the polished metal mirror, seeing a woman both older and more brittle than the bright-eyed girl she had once been. She forced a small smile. "I thank you all for your service," she told them. "I believe I need rest more than anything tonight." Her ladies curtsied, murmuring well wishes before departing. Once the door closed, Marjorie was alone. She moved to the window, gazing out at the flickering lights of King's Landing. Across the city, people were gossiping about the new marriage, the new king, the old grudges. She wondered if they truly cared who reigned, so long as they had bread and safety. Perhaps that was reason enough to continue this charade. A faint tap at the door jarred her from her thoughts. Frowning, she went to open it. To her surprise, Tyrion Lannister stood there, looking awkward and subdued. He bowed slightly. "Your Grace, my apologies for disturbing you." She blinked. "Lord Tyrion, I wasn't expecting visitors at this hour." He glanced over his shoulder, as though ensuring no one stood behind him. "May I speak with you? It concerns the future. Yours, mine, Tommen's, the realms." She hesitated, uncertain. She remembered well how Joffrey had tormented Tyrion, how the imp had once been accused of poisoning the king at the Purple Wedding. She also remembered Tyrion's attempts at kindness, especially to Sansa Stark. At length, she stepped back, opening the door. "Very well, but keep your voice down." He entered, and she closed the door quietly. By the light of a single candle, she studied his face. He seemed worn, with shadows under his mismatched eyes. His hair was unkempt, and he smelled faintly of wine. Still, he carried an air of quiet intelligence. "What do you want to say?" she asked softly. Tyrion clasped his hands in front of him, choosing his words carefully. "First, let me congratulate you on your new marriage, though I suspect this was hardly the wedding of your dreams." She gave a humorless chuckle. "I have learned to set aside dreams of wedded bliss, Lord Tyrion." He nodded gravely. "I understand. I also wanted to express, I suppose you could call it condolences. You've been dealt a harsh hand, forced to navigate the Lannister lion's den more than once. I know, as well as anyone, how dangerous that can be." Her pulse kicked up a notch. Tyrion was dancing around the subject of Joffrey's death. Did he suspect her? She kept her composure. "I've survived so far," she said, "though not without scars." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Precisely. I suspect you want the best for Tommen, for the realm, for yourself. As do I. We share an interest in preventing further bloodshed. With Joffrey gone," he paused, letting that note hang, "the realm might stand a chance at peace. Tommen is a sweet boy, easy to mold. But if we let Cersei rule him unchecked, we'll have a second Joffrey in no time, or a war with the Tyrells that tears Westeros apart." Her eyes narrowed. "And you believe you can stop her?" He shrugged, a self-deprecating gesture. Alone? No, my father holds the real power for now. But he's not immortal, and his grasp of certain aspects of governance, like the hearts of the people, can be short-sighted. You, on the other hand, have a gift for public sentiment. Tommen trusts you. He might come to trust me, too, if I play my cards right. Between us, we could temper the worst impulses of the Lannister regime, preserve the alliance with the Tyrells, keep the small folk fed, perhaps even usher in a lasting peace. Marjorie studied him in silence. She was certain Tyrion knew more than he admitted. He was famously perceptive. But if he suspected she had a hand in Joffrey's death, he gave no sign of condemning her for it. Perhaps he reasoned that Joffrey's removal benefited them both. That's a lofty ambition, she said carefully. I have no desire to undermine the Lannisters, only to protect my family and the realm. But I won't let Tommen become a monster like his brother. Nor will I let Cersei use him as a weapon against us. Tyrion inclined his head. Then our interests align. All I suggest is that we maintain a cordial understanding. If you learn of any scheme by Cersei or others to harm you or Tommen, tell me. I will do likewise. We can pool our resources. In time, if we are careful, Tommen can be raised to value compassion as well as strength. The flicker of candlelight danced over his face. Marjorie recalled his kindness to Sansa, how he'd tried to spare her from Joffrey, as cruelty. Tyrion was not the monster the gossip made him out to be. Agreed, she said softly. We can help each other, for Tommen's sake, and for the good of the realm. Tyrion gave a short bow. Thank you, Your Grace. I won't linger, lest rumors start. Good night. He turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. And best be cautious with your chambers. I've heard that the Queen Regent has a network of spies in these walls. She managed a small smile. I'll keep that in mind. Then he was gone, and Marjorie was left to the hush of her chamber. She breathed out slowly, thinking of the odd alliance's fate had thrust upon her. Tyrion's proposition held promise. She had no illusions that he was entirely altruistic. He wanted to ensure his own survival and influence. But that matched her aims as well. The realm might stand a chance if they worked in tandem, tempering Tywin's ruthlessness and Cersei's paranoia, guiding Tommen toward gentle rule. Yet beneath it all, a single stark truth remained. Joffrey's murder was unsolved in the eyes of the realm, and many suspected the Tyrells. If that truth ever surfaced, if Cersei or Tywin or even Tyrion found a scrap of proof, Marjorie's life would be forfeit. She had stepped onto the tightrope of power, high above a swirl of sharpened swords. One misstep and she would fall. She moved to the window once more, letting the night air brush her face. The city of King's Landing sprawled below in flickering torchlight. Somewhere out there, the small folk tried to scratch out a living, ignorant of the hidden game that determined whether they would starve or thrive. She closed her eyes, remembering Joffrey's purpled face, the rasp of his final breaths. She thought of the vow she had made, that the realm would be better without him. The realm might indeed be better now, she told herself. Yet she knew the next chapter of the story hinged on how she played the game and whom she chose to trust. If she failed, the bloodshed that had claimed one king would claim countless others. For now, though the city was quiet, the new king slept in his bed, and Marjorie Tyrell, now Baratheon, thrice a royal bride, stood alone, determined to transform a legacy of poison and betrayal into something resembling hope. Whether she could succeed, and whether the shadows of her crime would remain hidden, only the passing of moons and the shifting fortunes of the great game would decide. And in Westeros, the gods themselves seldom knew which way the dice would fall. Marjorie often woke before dawn, haunted by the memory of Joffrey's last breath and the knowledge that she had helped orchestrate it. Sometimes, she dreamed of the hall at her family's estate where the feast had taken place, the moment when Joffrey choked on the poison. She would wake with her heart hammering and her palms damp. Afterward, she always needed a moment to remind herself she was now queen to King Tommen, safely in King's Landing, her secret buried beneath layers of courtly politeness and carefully spun lies. But guilt had a way of finding even the most cunning conspirator. Every morning, she strove to carry herself with composure. She would bathe, don a gown of modest cut, and draw her hair back in a style that balanced dignity with approachability. This was her quiet message to the realm. She was not the seductive usurper Cersei claimed, nor the naive girl who had once married a barbarous king. She was something else, a woman who sought to preserve what stability could be found. And each day, she told herself anew that it was for the greater good. Joffrey's cruelty would have torn the 7 kingdoms to pieces, or so she believed. Tommen, kind and malleable, represented a chance at a gentler future. She spent her mornings with Tommen in a small solar near Maegor's Holdfast. There, the boy king received lessons on history, courtesy, and the basics of governance. Sometimes Grand Maester Pycelle droned at length about the ancient roots of the faith or the genealogies of old Valyria, and Tommen's eyes would grow heavy. Margaery would discreetly pass him a sweet biscuit or a bit of candied fruit to keep him alert. Other times, Ser Kevan Lannister or even Tywin himself appeared, quizzing Tommen on taxes and alliances, or instructing him on matters of law. Margaery sat alongside him, never overstepping while Tywin lectured, but she would offer soft words of encouragement when Tommen grew flustered. The boy often smiled at her gratefully, and Margaery felt a pang of tenderness, tempered by pity. He was sweet, earnest as a kitten, and though only a handful of years separated them, in life experience he felt far younger. It was almost as though she were guiding a nephew. He came to rely on her presence, seeking her approval when he answered Tywin's questions. She tried to reinforce good instincts: mercy, caution, generosity. Tommen's eyes lit whenever she praised him. Cersei, forced to watch from the sidelines, seethed at Margaery's influence. The Queen Regent, technically outranked now that her son had ascended, though everyone still called her by the old title, made no secret of her contempt. She would appear in the solar unannounced, trailing the faint scent of strong wine, and interrupt with barbed remarks. Tommen, flustered, tried to appease his mother's demands while Margaery offered polite deference. All the while, Cersei's gaze bore into Margaery as though seeking proof of wrongdoing. There was no shortage of friction. If Margaery complimented Tommen's reading, Cersei would snap that he ought to be practicing swordplay. If Margaery suggested that Tommen's authority must balance justice with kindness, Cersei sneered that queens from the Reach knew nothing of real power. Margaery bit her tongue. When the tension grew too thick, even Tywin would intervene, commanding Cersei to let the lessons proceed without her outbursts. In private, Margaery would sometimes escape to the gardens just to breathe the fresh air. The Red Keep's marble paths and manicured shrubs tried to evoke the beauty of Highgarden, though they lacked the charm she remembered from her girlhood. Still, it was the closest she came to peace in King's Landing. On these walks, she was often accompanied by a small retinue of her ladies-in-waiting, Alice and Eleanor among them, and sometimes by Ser Loras, who was released from his guard duties to attend her. He remained fiercely protective, unsettled by the undercurrents of suspicion that still clung to the Tyrell name. They rarely spoke of Joffrey's murder directly, but they both knew the threat. If a single piece of evidence surfaced, some careless hint left behind, Cersei would have the perfect excuse to brand the Tyrells as regicides. Even Tywin might not shield them if that day came. Tyrion Lannister's discreet visits became a strange source of relief. He would call upon Margaery now and then, always with a polite knock and a murmured explanation to her guards that he wished to discuss crown finances or trade opportunities. Once inside, he kept a respectful distance, mindful of gossips. Their conversations, hushed and carefully coded, revolved around how to guide Tommen without letting Cersei's paranoia derail him or the realm. Tyrion possessed deep knowledge of the city's political networks, from the guilds to the merchant fleet, and Margaery had a flair for winning public sentiment. He proposed small philanthropic gestures for Tommen to enact, like distributing bread in Flea Bottom or personally touring the city's orphanages, while Margaery suggested ways to present these acts so that Tommen's name might grow beloved. Slowly, they tried to shape the boy's image as a caring, just king. Tywin, for his part, did nothing to discourage these efforts, so long as the crown's debts were not neglected. Indeed, Tywin cared little whether the small folk adored Tommen. so long as order and discipline prevailed. He recognized, however, that a beloved king was less likely to be challenged by rebellious lords or foreign claimants. Stannis Baratheon still loomed across Blackwater Bay. If Tommen gained the people's love, fewer might rally behind a challenger. Still, the city bristled with unrest. Stories of Joffrey's murder grew more twisted with each retelling. Some whispered that the gods themselves had struck him down, while others insisted a masked Dornishman had slipped into the estate to avenge Oberyn Martell. The Tyrells, for all their influence, could not fully dispel the rumor that they had orchestrated it. Meanwhile, Cersei seemed to redouble her efforts to uncover any scrap of proof. Her maids in the Queen Regent's apartments told hair-raising tales of her rages, how she would fling goblets and upend tables in her search. She questioned servants who had traveled with Joffrey, demanded to see shipping manifests for the Tyrell estate, and even ventured to ask Pycelle about the chemical properties of poisons. But no conclusive evidence surfaced. All the while, the realm's broader troubles refused to vanish. The Ironborn increased their raids on the western coast, and the Greyjoys boasted that their drowned god would give them dominion over the seas. Tywin reluctantly diverted more ships to defend Lannisport and the coastal towns, draining some resources from King's Landing. Stannis Baratheon, though contained at Dragonstone, still possessed enough soldiers to pose a threat if the Crown's navy was weakened. Meanwhile, rumors filtered in from across the narrow sea about a Targaryen girl conquering cities in Slaver's Bay with dragons at her side. Most in the capital scoffed at the idea of dragons returning in true strength, but Tyrion, always the collector of strange lore, kept an ear open to such reports. He confided once to Margaery that House Targaryen had reigned by right of dragonfire for centuries. If any living Targaryen truly commanded dragons, the realm might be in for a storm of fire and blood the likes of which had not been seen in an age. Yet, for the moment, the new King Tommen's court functioned with uneasy cooperation. The boy took steps to win hearts, visiting an orphanage in the city, offering coin to repair battered wharfs, and reigning in some of the more blatant abuses by the gold cloaks. Margaery accompanied him on these outings, wearing a bright, hopeful smile. She encouraged him to speak kindly to children, to give them sweets and inquire after their well-being. It worked, in part. The crowds began to see Tommen as a gentle king, a stark contrast to the cruelty they had endured under Joffrey. Still, the Lannister bannermen, especially those close to Cersei, made sure no one forgot that House Lannister held the real reins of power. Cersei, in turn, tried to overshadow Margaery's influence. She hosted private suppers for Tommen, reciting tales of House Lannister's grandeur and cautioning him against the cunning roses who would twist him to their will. She exhorted him not to trust easily. Tommen, caught between his mother and his new queen, tried to please both, but his confusion showed. More than once, Margaery found him in the garden, shoulders slumped, uncertain which counsel to follow. She would gently advise him that his mother's experiences were shaped by her grief, and that while she deserved respect, he must also learn to weigh all advice carefully. It was a delicate balancing act, as Margaery did not want Tommen to cast off Cersei completely and spark a violent family schism. Each day, the palace's hush and tension seemed to grow, a quiet storm that might break at the slightest provocation. One afternoon, Margaery decided to host a modest gathering of ladies in the Maiden Vault, a portion of the Red Keep that was rarely used except for the occasional function. She invited noblewomen from houses Rosby, Stokeworth, and Hayford, houses close enough to King's Landing that their presence might matter to local opinion. She planned it as a subtle demonstration of Tyrell generosity and, by extension, Tommen's gentler rule. There would be music, a few amusements such as a singer or juggler, and light refreshments. The purpose was to let these ladies carry tales of Margaery's graciousness back to their families and sworn swords, reinforcing that the new queen was a friend to the city's stability. That morning, as Margaery supervised the final touches, checking the table linens, arranging small posies of flowers, Cersei swept in unannounced. The Queen Regent wore a gown of rich crimson velvet, her hair pinned up in a style that showed the slender line of her neck. She made an imposing figure, accompanied by 2 Lannister guards. Margaery's ladies curtsied hastily, and Margaery followed suit. "So," Cersei said, surveying the half-decorated hall, "you hold court without the king? Are you styling yourself as queen already?" Marjorie kept her tone mild. "We are merely hosting a small gathering for the ladies of the city. These families support the crown, and I hope to thank them for their loyalty." Cersei's lips twitched in a faint sneer. "How considerate. It seems you have an endless supply of honeyed gestures. I wonder, does your sweetness hide a sharper sting?" Marjorie lowered her eyes, feigning hurt. "I only wish to serve the throne, your grace. Perhaps you'd like to join us? It would be an honor." "An honor," Cersei repeated mockingly. "Your guests might be more comfortable speaking freely if I'm not here to loom over them with gold cloaks, I think." She toyed with a golden bracelet at her wrist. "Though I may pop in and out, one never knows what secrets are spilled over cups of wine." Marjorie inclined her head. "As you wish. We'll be delighted by your presence." With that, Cersei moved on, stalking about the hall in slow, deliberate steps. She inspected the arrangement of chairs, sniffed the posies of flowers, peered into the pitchers of chilled fruit juice. One of Marjorie's ladies, anxious under the Queen Regent's scrutiny, accidentally spilled a small bowl of sugared almonds. Cersei eyed her with contempt but said nothing. Then she returned to Marjorie, leaning in close enough that only Marjorie could hear her next words. "I'll not let you root yourself in my son's court the way you ensnared Joffrey." Cersei's breath smelled faintly of wine. "I've seen you coddle Tommen, showering him with sweet stories of virtue. Perhaps you think you'll turn him fully against me in time. It won't work. He's my blood." Marjorie kept her face carefully neutral, though her heart pounded. "Tommen loves you, my Queen Regent. I've never denied him that. My only hope is to serve him. Save your protestations." Cersei's grip closed on Marjorie's wrist. The nails bit into her skin through the fabric of her sleeve. "I haven't forgotten what happened to Joffrey. If I find a single shred of proof that you or your wrinkled grandmother had a hand in it, if I so much as catch a whiff of treason, I will drag you through these halls in chains and throw your head to the crows." Marjorie could only stare into the older woman's furious green eyes. They stood locked like that for a moment until footsteps approached, Alice returning with a tray of ribbons. Quickly, Cersei released her grip. A faint flush colored the Queen Regent's cheeks, and she turned away, striding toward the exit. Marjorie cradled her wrist discreetly, ignoring the sting. She drew a slow, steadying breath, then signaled to her ladies to resume their tasks. The gathering itself proceeded without open incident. About a dozen ladies arrived, exchanging pleasantries. Marjorie offered them trays of sweetmeats, arranged for a trio of musicians to play harp and lute, and engaged them in light gossip about the city's affairs. She avoided any direct mention of Joffrey's death, focusing instead on the future under Tommen. Lord Rosby's wife, a portly woman with a fondness for lemon cakes, praised the new king's gentleness, and Marjorie used the opportunity to underscore the importance of supporting him. She spoke about how Tommen was determined to restore trade, lower taxes on small merchants, and ensure a stable supply of bread. Perhaps these were half-truths. Tyrion and Tywin were the ones orchestrating such measures. But the more the city believed in Tommen's benevolence, the better for the realm. Cersei made a token appearance halfway through, drifting along the edges of conversation, letting her presence cast a subtle chill. The ladies dipped in curtsies, stammered compliments, and then resumed their talk at a more subdued volume. Marjorie sensed that Cersei was listening, searching for any sign of disloyalty. Yet everything remained perfectly harmless on the surface. After a few minutes, the Queen Regent claimed weariness and departed. Only once she was gone did the atmosphere warm again, though tension lingered. Marjorie pressed on, ensuring each lady left with a small token, a sachet of rose petals tied in green ribbon, a trifling gift, but a reminder of Tyrell courtesy. When the last guest departed, Alice turned to Marjorie with a relieved sigh. "Your Grace, you handled that well, but be cautious." The Queen Regent's eyes were on every corner of this hall. Marjorie nodded, exhaustion tugging at her. "I know. Thank you, Alice. I'll rest now." She retreated to her own chambers, sinking onto a cushioned window seat with her thoughts in a whirl. Cersei's threat echoed in her mind. Now more than ever, she realized how slender her margin for error was. One misstep, an ill-chosen word, a stray piece of evidence, and the Tyrell name could be branded traitorous. Tywin might not intervene this time. He had alliances to consider, debts to repay, and a realm to hold together. A single scapegoat would be far simpler than open war. Marjorie felt her pulse quicken with a wave of apprehension. That evening, Tyrion visited again under the pretext of discussing finances for upcoming city improvements. He found her sitting at a desk strewn with scraps of parchment. She'd been drafting letters to various lords, thanking them for their support of Tommen. At her nod, the ladies left them alone. Tyrion eyed the door until it closed, then spoke softly. "I hear your gathering was a success, mostly." Cersei prowled around as expected. "She threatened me, quite openly," Marjorie replied, trying to keep her voice even. "She said if she found proof of my involvement in Joffrey's death, she would have my head." Tyrion sighed and rubbed his temple. "That sounds like her. She rages at shadows, but rarely finds the light she seeks. Still, it's best not to provoke her." "I have no intention of provoking her," Marjorie said, "but I fear one day her fury might explode all the same, if her suspicions fester too long." Tyrion tilted his head in acknowledgement. "That is possible. My sister's anger can be as dangerous as wildfire, unpredictable and apt to consume everything. Hence why we must keep her from any real power. Unfortunately, she's the Queen Regent and mother to the king, so we can't simply cast her aside." Marjorie folded her hands together on the table. "Then what is your plan, my lord? You've mentioned we should work together to guide Tommen, to ensure the realm prospers. But how do we keep Cersei from unraveling all that?" Tyrion sank into a chair, swinging his short legs. "Ideally, I'd prefer to see Father remain the de facto ruler for another year or two. Tommen will have time to grow, to learn, to forge relationships with the lords. In that period, you can cement your popularity with the small folk. As for Cersei, let her indulge in minor intrigues so long as they pose no real threat. But watch her carefully. If she crosses a line, threatens open violence, or tries to eliminate key allies, then Tywin might have cause to restrain her. He may even send her away, as he once threatened to do." Gary considered that. "You think Tywin would dispatch her somewhere distant?" Tyrion's grin was humorless. "He threatened to send her to Casterly Rock before. Perhaps he'll try again if she grows too unruly. But it's a delicate matter, making that move without humiliating her. She's the mother of the king, after all, and rumor is a venomous foe." Marjorie nodded slowly. "And if it comes to that, I must appear blameless, merely a supportive wife to Tommen, concerned for his welfare, not an agitator." "Precisely," Tyrion agreed. "And in the meantime, I'll do my part. I have eyes around the city, watchers who note which lords visit Cersei. If she shows signs of concocting a new charge against you, I'll do what I can to undermine it." She exhaled, feeling a measure of relief. "Thank you." He waved a hand dismissively. "It's as I said, we share an interest in peace." His eyes grew more somber. "But let's not become complacent. Shadows gather outside the city walls. The Greyjoys, Stannis, rumors of Targaryens. If any of them sense weakness here, they'll strike. A civil war within our walls would be the perfect invitation." The weight of those words settled over her. She knew the realm was a tapestry of frayed threads. If one more tug came at the edges, everything could unravel. And ironically, the best chance for holding it all together might be the fragile rule of a child king, provided he could learn quickly, and provided they could hold Cersei's vengeance at bay. In that moment, Marjorie felt the full gravity of the path she had chosen when she conspired with Olenna to murder Joffrey. The burden of shaping the future had fallen on her shoulders. If she failed, war or tyranny would devour the land again. She summoned her will, determined to see it through. "Let us proceed carefully," she told Tyrion. "One step at a time." Summer began to wane. The days grew shorter, and the nights carried a hint of cool breeze that signaled autumn's slow approach. Farmers brought in their harvests, and grain carts rattled through King's Landing's gates. Tywin pressed the Tyrells for more shipments, ensuring the capital would not starve once winter came. Mace Tyrell, pompous yet eager to please, confirmed that wagon loads of grain, olives, and salted fish would arrive monthly from Highgarden and its vassals. Margaery oversaw much of the correspondence, carefully praising the generosity of the Tyrell bannermen and emphasizing Tommen's gratitude. At court, the routine of governance settled into a pattern. Tywin dominated the small council, while Kevan and Tyrion supervised critical matters. Cersei remained the official queen regent, but her advisement was frequently sidelined. She noticed, of course, and seethed. Yet Tywin dismissed her attempts to meddle in major affairs, telling her curtly that she would have more than enough to do once Tommen was a few years older and asked for her help in matters of policy. For now, the implicit message was that her emotional state made her unsuitable for leadership. Still, she lurked in the corridors, listening at council chamber doors or colluding with lesser courtiers who disliked the Tyrell ascendancy. A few of the old families resented the Tyrells, seeing them as upstarts who had seized power through cunning marriages. Cersei singled them out, inviting them to private dinners, forging quiet alliances. Margaery's watchers, some loyal maids, a few discreet guards, reported these gatherings back to her. She felt the tension like a drawn bowstring, certain that someday it might snap. One afternoon, word reached the Red Keep that Stannis Baratheon's ships had departed Dragonstone, possibly heading for the Narrow Sea or maybe the northern coasts. The city panicked at first, fearing another assault on King's Landing. But as more ravens arrived, it seemed Stannis had directed his fleet elsewhere, some rumored to the Wall, some to White Harbor. The War of the Five Kings had worn him down, yet his belief in his cause, fueled by the Red Priestess, kept him active. Tywin regarded this news with wary relief. At least King's Landing would be spared another siege for the moment. Around that same time, a letter arrived from Dorne. Prince Doran Martell expressed condolences on Joffrey's passing, somewhat belatedly, and extended cautious greetings to King Tommen. Dorne had chafed under Lannister rule since Oberyn Martell's death, yet so far they had not risen in open rebellion. The letter hinted that if Tommen sought to make amends for past wrongs, House Martell might be open to negotiation. Tywin responded with measured politeness, inviting a Dornish envoy to court. Margaery saw in his eyes that he did not trust the Martells an inch. He only wanted to keep them pacified until the Lannisters consolidated control. All the while, Margaery maintained her daily presence at Tommen's side, sitting through council sessions when allowed, or guiding the Child King through the keep's halls to greet visiting lords. She served as a gentle mediator, calming his nerves, teaching him social grace. The people's perception of the new king improved. A few even composed songs that praised his mild nature. Street corner minstrels sometimes sang such ballads, hoping to charm passing guards for coin. That budding goodwill was fragile but real. If only the realm had more time to solidify it. Late one evening, after Tommen was abed, Margaery found herself in the royal library, a vaulted chamber lined with shelves of ancient tomes. She wanted to read up on certain historical precedents, how child kings had fared in centuries past. There were examples of regents who abused their powers, kings overshadowed by tyrannical mothers or uncles, and dynasties undone by infighting. She was determined not to let Tommen become another footnote in a cycle of tragedy. As she perused a dusty book by candlelight, someone cleared their throat behind her. It was Jaime Lannister, standing by the door in a simple surcoat and cloak. He inclined his head in greeting. "Your Grace," he said. "Sir Jaime." She offered him a cordial smile, though they had not often spoken in private since Joffrey's funeral journey. "I didn't hear you come in." He nodded toward the thick carpet. "It muffles footsteps. Apologies if I startled you." She closed the tome and set it aside. "No apologies needed. Did you wish to speak with me?" Jaime hesitated. She noticed the subtle tension in his posture, the set of his shoulders, the way his good hand flexed. "I came to see if you needed anything, or if Tommen did." He told me earlier you were helping him study the old laws. I know how exhausting that can be for a child. I wanted to see if you required more official support. Marjorie studied his face. She had gleaned bits of Jaime's mindset in the past. He was torn between loyalty to his blood family and a certain weariness with their cruelty. She decided to speak frankly. Tommen is faring well enough. He's a bright boy, eager to learn. But I do worry that the weight of the crown might become too heavy if we push him too hard. Jaime nodded slowly. You're not wrong. I was never a scholar myself, but I recall how politics can suffocate a child if forced upon him too soon. She tilted her head. Some say you were a reckless youth, Sir Jaime. He snorted faintly. They're not wrong. I found my calling in swordplay, not in scrolls. His gaze drifted to his stump, concealed by the folds of his cloak. That calling has changed somewhat, but I still want the best for Tommen. Marjorie let a note of sympathy into her voice. You've lost much for the sake of family. If I may speak plainly, your sister's anger. It hinders Tommen's growth more than it helps. His face hardened. Cersei is grieving. She's not always rational in that state. I understand grief. Marjorie thought of how she had publicly grieved for Joffrey. But we must also be mindful of how it distorts our choices. Jaime's eyes flicked toward the door, as if to ensure no one else listened. He stepped closer, keeping his voice low. I've tried to reason with her. She believes you pose a threat to Tommen, perhaps even to his life. I do not share that belief, but she sees traitors in every shadow. Marjorie's throat tightened. We both know I'm no threat to Tommen's life. I only want to guide him. Jaime held her gaze. I believe you. He paused. Though I didn't always. Part of me suspected. Well, you understand. She nodded, guessing he referred to Joffrey's poisoning. She forced a calm reply. I see no use in dwelling on the past. The present demands that Tommen have stability. Jaime exhaled. Yes, stability. He looked about to say more, then pressed his lips together. After a moment he spoke again, voice quieter. I wanted to ask, if you find yourself threatened, if Cersei's rages grow beyond reason, will you come to me? I'm sworn to protect the king, and by extension, the queen. I'd rather intervene early than see more tragedy. Marjorie studied him. She saw honesty there and a certain regret. Jaime, for all his flaws, might truly wish to prevent another bloodbath. Thank you, Sir Jaime, she said softly. I will remember your offer. He inclined his head. Then I'll leave you to your books, your grace. She watched him depart, thoughtful. The lines in his face betrayed the burden he carried. A love for Cersei, a desire to protect Tommen, and a revulsion toward the cruelty that had once defined Joffrey. If she could rely on Jaime's vow in a crisis, it might tip the balance in her favor. But she also knew Cersei would regard that trust as a bitter betrayal. The seeds of conflict lay everywhere, waiting for the right spark. Weeks edged closer to months. Tommen's reign continued without outright disaster, though the city remained tense. Marjorie hosted occasional gatherings, each time overshadowed by the knowledge that Cersei might appear. She also spent hours conferring with Tyrion about how to bolster Tommen's public image. The crown finances were still precarious, but Tyrion arranged small gestures, like a day of sponsored bread largesse at the gates, to show that Tommen cared for the poor. The cost was modest compared to lavish feasts of the old court, and the goodwill gained was considerable. Marjorie personally handed out the first loaf to a ragged mother, who wept with gratitude. Reports from around the realm trickled in. The Boltons in the north faced scattered uprisings from Stark loyalists, though rumor claimed the Boltons were holding Winterfell. The Vale remained distant, with Lady Lisa Arryn rumored to be in thrall to Peter Baelish. The Ironborn menaced the western coasts as ever, though Tywin had consolidated a fleet at Lannisport to repel them. Stannis' whereabouts were uncertain, though some said he had sailed to the north to face the wildling threat. An odd turn if true. And across the sea, the Targaryen girl was rumored to have conquered Meereen. None of these threats was immediate, but each cast a shadow on the future. Then, late one morning, a messenger arrived from the west bearing troubling tidings. The Ironborn had launched a surprise raid on Case, not far from Lannisport. Word was that Balon Greyjoy's fleet, or perhaps his daughter Yara's, had landed men on the shoreline, sacking small villages, burning fields, and abducting locals. Tywin convened a council meeting in the Tower of the Hand. Marjorie, as queen, was present, seated beside Tommen while he tried to maintain a regal bearing. Cersei stood behind Tommen's chair, her arms folded, face tight. Kevan Lannister briefed them. The Ironborn retreat as quickly as they strike, making them difficult to trap. Lord Damian Lannister at Lannisport requests additional ships and men. Our fleet can repel a direct attack, but these raids harass the coastline, sowing fear and chaos. We need a better strategy than mere defense. Tywin's voice was firm. The Greyjoys must be reminded of their place. They bent the knee when Balon rebelled the first time. He lost 2 of his sons then. Now it seems he grows bold again. We'll muster ships from King's Landing to bolster Lord Damian. Ser Jaime will coordinate with the Western forces. Jaime inclined his head but did not speak. Cersei's eyes flicked to Marjorie as though seeking to see if she had any reaction. Marjorie kept her expression neutral. As far as she knew, the Tyrells had no direct quarrel with the Greyjoys, beyond the universal annoyance of their raids. Tommen cleared his throat, trying to adopt a kingly tone. Can we not reason with the Ironborn? Offer them some concession if they withdraw. Cersei sneered. They understand only strength, Tommen. Concessions will make us appear weak. Tywin nodded curtly. Indeed, we will not pay pirates to leave us be. We will show them the might of the crown. He glanced at Tommen. Your sentiment is noted, but in this instance, force is the surest deterrent. Tommen lowered his gaze. Yes, grandfather. The meeting continued, discussing logistics and possible alliances along the western seaboard. Tyrion asked a few pointed questions about how to finance the new ships, reminding Tywin that coin was already stretched. Tywin dismissed him with a curt remark. We will find the gold. The Tyrell coffers run deep. Is that not so, Lady Marjorie? All eyes turned to her. She lifted her chin. Highgarden is prepared to lend the crown assistance, as we have been doing, but I'll need to speak with my father about additional sums for shipbuilding. Tywin waved a dismissive hand, as if the details were beneath him. Do so. The realm must be secured. Cersei's lip curled, but she said nothing. The meeting soon ended, with plans set in motion to dispatch more ships west. Marjorie left the council chamber alongside Loras, who had quietly stood guard in the corridor. He murmured to her, another war brewing on the coast. We'll have to send men, perhaps some from the Reach. Father won't refuse if pressed. Marjorie gave a weary sigh. Yes, more blood spilled to maintain peace. Better there than here, Loras said with a grim shrug. I hate to say it, but I'd rather see the fighting remain far from King's Landing. She could not disagree. The city was a tinderbox. If any serious conflict erupted near its gates, the tenuous calm they had built around Tommen might shatter. Time pressed on. The month's turning brought mild autumn weather, with red and gold leaves swirling in the keep's gardens. King's Landing bustled with trade caravans rushing to finalize deals before winter. Marjorie continued her daily dance of courtesy, building alliances with lesser houses, feeding the rumor mills with talk of Tommen's generosity. Tyrion orchestrated the financial side, ensuring enough coin flowed to appease the Iron Bank while still paying for ships and city upkeep. Tywin managed the broader strategy, dispatching armies, forging alliances, and crushing dissent. Cersei prowled like a caged lion, resentful of her father's dominance and Marjorie's popularity, her anger sharpened by the wine she drank more frequently. Jaime tried to mediate but often found himself torn. One cool afternoon, Marjorie joined Tommen on a walk along the castle ramparts. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows. Guards trailed at a respectful distance, though Marjorie suspected half of them reported to Cersei. Tommen wore a cloak trimmed with fur, his cheeks pink from the breeze. He was growing taller, but still had a boyish roundness to his face. They paused at a crenellation overlooking Blackwater Bay. The water glimmered in the setting sun. Tommen leaned forward, eyes on the distant horizon. "Marjorie," he said softly, "do you think I'm doing well as king?" She studied his anxious expression. "I do," she answered gently. "You've shown compassion, and you listened to your advisors. You've tried to be fair. Those are all good qualities in a ruler." He blew out a breath. "Mother thinks I should be more decisive. She says I appear weak." "Your mother lost your brother," Marjorie said carefully. "Her grief might make her see threats everywhere, urging you to be harsh. But sometimes harshness only breeds resentment." Tommen bit his lip. "Grandfather told me that a king must be feared and respected. But how do I do that without hurting people?" Marjorie placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling a maternal rush of protectiveness. "Fear can ensure obedience, but love can bring loyalty. The trick is balancing them. Your grandfather is right that a ruler must not appear weak. People might take advantage. But that doesn't mean cruelty is the answer. Let the law guide you. Punish lawbreakers firmly but fairly. Offer kindness where it's merited. Over time, your people will see you as both just and strong. That's better than raw fear." He nodded slowly, as though absorbing her words. "I see. And you'll help me?" "Always, Your Grace," she said, pressing her hand lightly against his cloak. "We're in this together." He smiled then, a bright, trusting smile that both warmed her heart and weighed her conscience. She silently vowed she would protect him from Cersei's more destructive impulses, and from the Lannister hunger for total control. If he could grow into manhood without the cruelty Joffrey possessed, perhaps the realm would finally find peace. Below them, the city's rooftops glowed in the sunset. Marjorie could see ships in the bay, the Red Keep's walls stretching around them, the winding streets that led to Flea Bottom. She wondered how many souls down there thanked the gods for Joffrey's demise, or how many cursed the crown for its continuing taxes and wars. In truth, the fate of thousands teetered on the choices made by a handful of people in these high walls. They continued walking, Tommen occasionally asking about the day's lessons or the best ways to reward a loyal knight. Marjorie replied, conjuring examples from the chivalric tales she'd once loved. She avoided illusions about the ugliness behind the songs. Tommen was still too young for that. Let him believe in honorable knights a little longer. Their steps eventually led them back inside, where a steward announced that Ser Loras awaited Marjorie's presence in the courtyard. Tommen excused her with a slight bow, heading off to see his cat, Ser Pounce, before supper. Marjorie descended a spiraling stone staircase, mentally shifting from nurturing Tommen to dealing with Loras, who might have new intelligence from their father about the Ironborn campaign or a fresh entreaty about Marjorie's security. She found her brother near the stables, wearing a plain cloak over his Kingsguard armor. He'd removed the ornate white garment for practicality. His expression was troubled, brow furrowed. When he saw her approach, he inclined his head but did not smile. "What is it?" she asked quietly, searching his face. Loras glanced around to ensure no one lingered too close. "I've just spoken with one of our cousins who arrived from Highgarden. He carried a letter from grandmother." At the mention of Olenna, Marjorie tensed. Her grandmother was the architect of the scheme that ended Joffrey. She was also the sharpest mind in House Tyrell. "What does she say?" Loras drew a folded parchment from inside his cloak. "She says the tensions with the Lannisters worry her. Father is too eager to please Tywin, but not cunning enough to manage Cersei. Grandmother fears Cersei's vendetta might find an opportunity if we remain in the capital too long. She suggests you consider a journey back to Highgarden, perhaps under the pretext of visiting family or overseeing the harvest festival. Anything to put distance between you and Cersei." Marjorie's heart thud. Addition leaving now would mean abandoning Tommen. That would cripple her ability to guide him, leaving him alone with Cersei. Tywin might step in, but who knew how that would shape the boy's development? "If I depart, Cersei could turn him against me more easily, or she might try to keep me from returning." Loras nodded grimly. "I know. I told grandmother the same. but she insists that the risk of staying grows each day we remain. Cersei's hatred is not cooling. Olenna thinks that if you're outside the keep, you'll be safer from any false accusations that might lead to a trial. Or worse, Marjorie finished in a hushed tone. She remembered how Tyrion had once been imprisoned under false charges at Joffrey's wedding. If Cersei found even flimsy evidence, she could push for a public arrest. Tywin might not intervene swiftly, especially if it served the realm's interest to appease Cersei's fury. And father sides with grandmother, Loras added. He wants you to come home, but I told him you might refuse, out of loyalty to Tommen. Marjorie steeled herself. I cannot leave the boy unguarded, Loras. He depends on me more every day. If I vanish, Cersei will fill his head with poison. Tywin is aging, he can't watch Tommen at all hours. And Tyrion, for all his cleverness, lacks the authority to keep Cersei's influence in check. Her brother lowered his voice further. I understand, truly, but you must weigh your devotion to Tommen against the risk. This realm is still fragile. If you were arrested and tried for Joffrey's murder, do you think the truth wouldn't come out? Or at least suspicions that implicate our house? The alliance would shatter, and war might erupt. Highgarden would be forced to respond. Thousands could die. A chill slid down Marjorie's spine. She had known the stakes from the moment she helped plan the poison. Every day since, she had avoided thinking too deeply about the cataclysm that might ensue if discovered. But Loras's words brought it all to the surface. If she were cornered, if Cersei managed to lay official blame on House Tyrell, the consequences would be catastrophic. Still, leaving Tommen felt like a betrayal. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her thoughts. I need time, she murmured. Let me think. I'll talk to Tyrion, maybe even Jaime. There could be a way to quell Cersei's suspicions or redirect them. If I can ensure some measure of stability, then I might leave for a short visit with plausible reasons. But not before ensuring Tommen has proper guidance in my absence. Loras exhaled with relief. Of course. Just please be careful, Marjorie. Grandmother does not send warnings lightly. She nodded, slipping the folded parchment into her own cloak. I'll do what I must. They parted, Loras returning to his duties, Marjorie wandering toward the keep's interior corridors. Her mind raced with the dilemma. If she stayed, she risked a confrontation with Cersei. If she left, she might lose her influence over Tommen entirely. Cersei would find a way to keep her out, perhaps, or the boy would come to resent her abandonment. She needed to find a middle path, one that safeguarded both herself and the realm. As she turned down a hallway, she found Tyrion waiting, as if by chance. He gave a small bow. Your Grace, I was hoping to catch you. There's a matter of city logistics. She cut him off gently. Lord Tyrion, I have a more pressing concern. Do you have time to walk with me? He raised an eyebrow but nodded. Certainly. They strolled together, passing a few clusters of courtiers who paused to bow. Marjorie led Tyrion to a secluded terrace overlooking the castle yard, where a single guard stood watch. She dismissed the guard with a polite smile, sending him to fetch her a handkerchief from her chambers. Once alone, she turned to Tyrion. I've received a letter from my grandmother, urging me to leave King's Landing for a while, she said quietly. She fears Cersei might soon lash out at me. My father concurs. Tyrion pursed his lips. And do you share their fear? Cersei grows bolder in her threats. If she conjures some shred of evidence, even false evidence, Tywin may decide appeasing her is simpler than defending me. The consequences would be dire for House Tyrell, for the Alliance, for Tommen. But I cannot simply abandon him. Tyrion leaned against the terrace wall, gazing out at the yard below. A thorny predicament. If you remain, you gamble with your life. If you depart, you risk losing your hold on Tommen. Precisely, she said, studying his face. I'm hoping you might suggest a strategy to keep me safe here, or at least keep Cersei's accusations from becoming a real threat. If not, I might have no choice but to leave. Tyrion's mismatched eyes flicked up to meet hers. For a moment, he seemed genuinely concerned. I can provide some measure of protection. My spies keep track of Cersei's attempts to gather evidence. If she tries to forge letters or bribe witnesses, I might intercept that. I could also speak with Father. Remind him that your presence is integral to Tommen's popularity. He's practical enough to see reason. But none of that is foolproof. Marjorie nodded. I see. Alternatively, Tyrion went on, we could attempt to direct Cersei's suspicions elsewhere. Find another scapegoat. She stiffened. I don't want to see an innocent person punished for this. He shrugged sadly. I share your distaste, but in these halls, innocence is often irrelevant. If it's a choice between letting her pin the murder on you, or some fictitious assassin from Dorne, or a disgruntled Stormlands bannerman, well, the realm might prefer a scapegoat who can't mount a serious challenge. Marjorie felt a surge of revulsion. This was the brutal arithmetic of politics. I'd prefer not to stoop to that if there's another way. Another way could be a formal betrothal for your brother, or some new financial arrangement. Something that further cements the Lannister-Tyrell alliance. It might soothe Cersei to see your family doubling down on loyalty. Your father and my father have discussed marrying my brother to Cersei herself, Marjorie ventured, recalling half-formed rumors. Tyrion's eyebrows shot up. That would be a spectacularly awful pairing, but it might appease her pride, ironically. Cersei might relish the chance to overshadow Loras, or she might recoil in horror at wedding a Tyrell. It's a risk. Marjorie's lips curved in a humorless smile. A big risk. I can't see Loras consenting gladly. Nor can I, but Tywin might force it if he sees advantage. Any union that ties the families more firmly is a deterrent to open conflict. That's how he thinks. She rubbed her temples. Gods, let me think. Tyrion inclined his head. If you can stall, do so. Meanwhile, I'll keep an eye on any moves from Cersei. If push comes to shove, you could arrange a short trip to Highgarden with Tommen's blessing, but do it in such a way that your return is guaranteed. Bring enough of your retinue, set a date to come back for a festival or some royal function. That might protect your influence, but it's a gamble. Marjorie straightened, deciding that might be the path forward. Yes, if I can persuade Tommen that I'm not abandoning him but rather negotiating some key matter for the crown, I could maintain my place. Then I'd swiftly return. Perhaps claim it's to finalize the next shipments or to handle a dispute at the Mander crossing. Tyrion's face lit with cautious approval. That could work. If you frame it as service to the king, Tywin would likely support it, especially if you bring back more provisions or coin. Cersei might seethe, but she can't accuse you of fleeing if it's officially sanctioned by Tommen's decree. She felt a measure of hope. Yes, that's it. I'll speak to Tommen soon. I'll say that father needs me to mediate a dispute, or that the harvest is threatened by local bandits. If I ask for his official permission to travel, he'll feel important, and so will I. Then, when I depart, it will be as the king's envoy, not as a queen running away. And you can return once the matter is resolved, Tyrion finished. It could buy you time as well. If in your absence Cersei conjures some new scheme, you'll at least be out of the line of fire. Relief and apprehension mingled in Marjorie's chest. Thank you, Lord Tyrion. I'll proceed carefully. He gave a short bow. I'll do what I can to smooth the way. Gods be with you. They parted, and Marjorie returned to her rooms with renewed purpose. She would not vanish from Tommen's life without a plan. She would stage a carefully constructed trip to Highgarden, ensuring it appeared entirely in service to the crown. That way, she could quell Olenna's fears, preserve her standing, and hopefully avoid giving Cersei an opportunity to strike. Yet as she laid out her next steps on parchment that night, she felt a pang of uncertainty. Every scheme in King's Landing courted fresh dangers. If she left, even under Tommen's blessing, Cersei might still turn the boy's mind against her. Or if new storms broke, like a sudden threat from Dorne or a crisis with the Greyjoys, she might be summoned back early, or find herself blocked from returning at all. The Great Game was as lethal as any battlefield, with fewer swords but no shortage of hidden blades. When she curled up in her bed that evening, she found sleep elusive, her mind churning with details of how to phrase her petition to Tommen, how to persuade Tywin, how to keep Cersei from suspecting a hidden agenda. If she succeeded, she might avoid the worst outcome for a time. If she failed, the life she had built around Tommen's reign could collapse in an instant, and the truth of Joffrey's murder might surface with devastating force. She pressed a hand over her heart, recalling the vow she had made to ensure the realm did not suffer another Mad King. That vow had demanded a terrible act. Now it demanded her unflinching resolve to keep the secret buried. She told herself that her cause was just, that many more lives would have been lost had Joffrey continued to reign. Still, the memory of his purpled face haunted her. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to envision a peaceful future instead. Tommen, grown into a wise and beloved king, the realm prospering, no more wars or betrayals. The dream offered a sliver of solace, even if it felt distant. If she had any say in it, she would see that dream made real. Dawn arrived with a thin film of mist over the Blackwater. Marjorie rose to greet the day, summoning every ounce of composure and cunning she possessed. She would speak to Tommen, make her petition. She would keep a watchful eye on Cersei, coordinate with Tyrion, measure every word she spoke to Tywin. Another day, another turn of the wheel of fate. And if the gods were kind, if all her hidden allies played their parts, she just might keep the realm from sliding back into chaos. For now, at least, she lived to fight another day. And if the game demanded a new gambit, Marjorie Tyrell Baratheon, Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, would make her move with all the subtlety and grace she could muster. The ghost of Joffrey's final gasp would not stop her. She had chosen her path long ago, and she would see it through.